Well, I think it's time to make a film about colour now. Although I've done a whole video on drawing in colour, I'll just show you the basics of colour and some of the most important facts about it: broken colour, colour intensity, colour tones and so on, the colour circle, complementary colours, and where we go from all of that. I'll do some demonstrations for you and give you the very basics then, the skeleton, the foundation. You really can't paint without a knowledge of colour and the medium. So I'll go into it in some detail and discuss all of these parts with you so that you'll hopefully have a much better understanding at the end of this film. What colours do you buy and what make or type of paints do you buy is a question I'm often asked. We really can't run before we can walk though, can we? It will depend upon the type of work you want to do, the type of subject you want to do, and the type of techniques that you want to use. Like most things, usually the more expensive, the higher quality the materials and the better they are, the more permanent the colours and so on. I would say this certainly with watercolour. Do not buy students' watercolour, only buy artist watercolour. There is no saving in buying students. They aren't the same quality, transparency, and they won't go as far. I love unison pastels and I also love the SAA pastels, so two good sets of pastels to buy there, nice and soft, good quality. And well-known makes of oil paints and acrylics are also very good. You can get away with students' quality in oils and acrylics, but you will find that the acrylics are a little bit thinner. I've just shown you here sheets and palettes of the colours that I use to give you an idea. All of these palettes will give you full use of almost every subject you can think of. But to explain this more clearly, let's now look at some of my paintings that are done in different methods and different ways and different materials to see how this would work. For instance, the FW acrylic inks are much more vibrant and stronger than watercolours. Oils are usually more intense than the acrylics. Here's an example of a demonstration I did for an art society some years ago, where I actually show the full mixture of the palettes that I use, the warm and cool greens and so on. So here you can see the importance of learning about colour. Not only the mediums we paint with and the quality of those are important, also the surface that we paint upon, whether it be paper, canvas or whatever. Here you see a watercolour paper. It's a quality watercolour paper, £140 knot. This is a smooth watercolour paper. It's a hot press watercolour paper on which watercolour pencil was used. Here I'm using pastels over acrylic inks on a not watercolour paper, so an intermediate textured surface. And then because I want a very rough texture for snow, I'm onto a rough paper so that I can use pencil and watercolour and pastel over each other to give the texture of snow. On this painting of the sea, I wanted a much finer canvas because I wanted to do more detailed work. Then it's onto a much larger canvas where I wanted to use spray cans and spray can art, so I wanted a much smoother surface, the same sort of canvas, but many coats of primer to start with to get a much smoother surface to spray onto. Then an ordinary painting on a rougher canvas with much heavier opaque oil paint where I really built it up into a three-dimensional texture. And then you move on to an ordinary canvas where I've used gold leafing and oil pastels and melted the oil pastels on, so very different ways of working. And then next on to another more detailed work with glazing where I painted the canvas dark first of all of the black ground and then worked glazes of acrylics over the top. When I'm talking about colour and techniques, I'm also going to discuss broken colour, the impressionist use of colour, where you might mix red and yellow dots together to give the effect of orange, as I've done here. Or the opposites in the colour circle, where we might get yellow, for instance, with purple to give shadows that are much more vibrant. We need to use the colour and techniques and methods for the actual mood of the painting as well. Here I've used acrylics and then put oils over the top to get the final vibrance at the end and then the soft background colours, because we are after a time of day and an atmosphere. The use of acrylic inks, which are much brighter than watercolours. Here we use wet into wet technique to get this effect of a nighttime scene in a city. The use of mixed media as well, where I've used here tissue paper glued onto the board surface, an MDF surface, and then used acrylic inks, and then used acrylics, and then used oils at the end to get this vibrant, quite large picture using this composite of butterfly wings. A quick study here on plein air of using unison pastels on ongras paper in an ongras pad out in New Zealand. And continuing with mixed medium, here we've got acrylic inks with pastels over the top on a watercolour paper again to give a nice lively loose effect. In the next instance I was painting in the Hebrides on plein air out of doors, and I had a large piece of hot pressed smooth watercolour paper pre-primed with dark acrylic paint, and then I'm using pastels over the top of that, about half an hour in freezing cold weather. On a canvas again, this time the broken colour technique using oil paint, and just building up in little dots and dashes of colour until the painting, like a jigsaw, forms together. Atmosphere again, wet into wet watercolour up in Scotland to give the effect of these dour days of the rain coming down from hanging clouds. Again I wanted vibrancy and freshness. This is a studio work painted with acrylics and then oils over the top, gradually built up to give this vibrancy of the woman picking flowers in the garden. Back to this much softer scene with exactly the same paints, oil paints again, but painted with a different key of colours, much bluer, much cooler, to bring out the marsh effect. And then on to mixed media again, where I built up with all sorts of things from Kellogg's cornflakes to rice and peas and seeds and all sorts, using PVA glues and so on, building up a ground and different keys. So we've got the warm key, then a cool key next. We're going to discuss warm and cool colours to give totally different effects of summer and winter, and playing with texture and abstraction. To understand a bit more about how to paint and how to draw, it might be useful to know how we actually see. We see by colour and tone. If we had a totally light white room with no shadows at all and furniture in it, and there were no shadows or form, we wouldn't see anything but a white space. But as soon as we put a light in there and cause shadow, we can see around things. Pigment is just a whole mass of powder, isn't it? It is little granules of colour, and those, when they're merged together, as these dots are, begin to form a tone. So if we had print making on a newspaper and the dots were larger, as they got smaller and smaller they would blend and we'd start to get a pattern like this. And if we start to leave light and dark areas, then we start to see shapes. In other words, the eye is being fooled by these dots, as we shall see in the Impressionist technique later of broken colour. We're telling a lie, we're telling a fib, we're making an illusion of forms and three-dimensional shapes on a flat surface. Let's take this a stage further now, and you see how these lines start to actually form shapes and volume. We start to see a tubular shape. And then by adding shadows, or by adding further shapes, the mind and the eye is fooled into seeing solid forms on the surface. In doing this, we find ways of creating not only the shape of the form, but where it stands in space, whether it stands above something, whether it's on a level, as we just saw there, how much there is between the object and the surface below, whether it's a round or spherical or flat. And as we play with these different shadings on these surfaces, we also get the feeling of what material it might be too, whether it might be metal. But now I'm coming into the subject of drawing more than colour, although this is very important for our colour as well. For instance, in portraiture it's very important to have the light at the right angle to show a portrait, whether it's from in front or beside or three-quarter view, is vital to our choice of the composition. Next, it's important to understand the difference between colour intensity and tone. Here you see a painting I've done that's quite bright in colour, but when photographed everything looks much duller. The yellows, which seem very, very bright, are much duller when turned into tone. If we look at the actual colour circle and some colours below that, and then we look at that again in black and white, we'll see that colours that seem very colour intense and very bright, such as the yellows and reds, are in fact much duller when photographed in black and white. If you squint your eyes down and look at something, you'll see the thing more tonally. If you want to see more colours, have your eyes much wider. So when you squint down, you'll see the closeness of the tones. It cuts things down much more easily for you to draw and see the colours as tones. Here a painting of Beverley Minster, and just look at the way some of those brighter colours go much duller when they're in tones. This is an important thing to realise. Next we're going to go on to the properties of colour, with the primary colour, secondary and tertiary, and it goes beyond that, as you can see here. To keep this film as short as possible, I'm having to work very quickly for you, so you may have to go through it again, but I will try and be as clear as I can. In this case we're going now to talk about the armoury we have, the amount of versatility we have with colour. So we need to know about the colour circle, we need to know about complementary colours and so on. So our most important and first or primary colours are red, yellow and blue. I'm going to show you later on how we mix these to make all the other various colours. The secondary from those are going to be orange, purple and green. and then we go on to the tertiary colours after that, which will include the browns, and also I'm going to include greys in that. Within that we have the colour intensity, how strong actual colours are in pigment, how vibrant they are, how they work one to another. That means we come then into complementary colours. Now, complementary colours are very much about one opposite colour to another and how they affect each other. So yellow to purple, or green to red, or blue to orange. And again, let's see how that works. I did show you this earlier with a beach painting where I had done a yellow beach and purple shadows. But if we look at the opposites of orange to blue, red to green and yellow to purple, they don't look too much just on their own like this. They look quite dull. If we want to paint somebody with a fluorescent jacket on the beach or on a road or something, then we can't use fluorescent paint. We're going to have to use colours of warms and cools and the opposites in the colour circle to work for us. Here's an example then. Here are those opposites, the complementary colours in the colour circle inside each other, and see how much more vibrant they are and give the effect of being fluorescent. This happens in nature as well, in warning signs and so on. Here's a worksheet showing that. Then we come on to the warms and the cool side, the passive range and the active range, how it's more warmer in the active range and cooler in the passive. And warm and cool colours are going to be very important as well. We go beyond that from the secondary to tertiary and quaternary and even quinary colours. But we don't need to go too much into that in depth. I'll explain when I do the actual colour mixing with you with brushes. It's important that you understand the difference between warm and cool colours as well. It's very simple. Think of ice and flame. So blues are cooler and the reds are warmer. Here you can see those colours gradually going round in the colour circle from warm to cool of almost every colour there is. In yellows there's a cooler yellow such as lemon, or a warmer yellow such as cadmium. In blues it goes more from the purples, which is the warmer colour, through to the reds that you see here on the middle left. So you see we have cool and warms of every colour there is. And we use that in our paintings. Here you can see how I use the cool and warm effects on these snow and ice scenes of the sunlight coming through between the cool shadows to get the effects. And the colour intensity as well of playing cools against warms and lights against darks tonally, as well as the contrast in colour. So that's the basics on tone, colour intensity and warm and cool colours. Now let's look at broken colour. If, as the Impressionists, we paint with little dots of, say, red and yellow, it will fool the eye from a distance into thinking it's blending it into orange, as we see here. This is the Impressionist technique and it's very vibrant. Colours actually do that anyway, because when we mix the pigments, those pigments are gradually mixing together to fool the eye at a much, much smaller range, because they're very, very fine then. So the larger the dots, the less the eye is fooled, and the smaller the dots together, as in pointillism, the closer they come together and therefore fool the eye into making a mix. We can do that with lines as well. Here's a crosshatch piece in pastel, which is almost pointillist or impressionist because the colours are blending. Next we look at just how a few colours can be made to work rather than a whole palette full. Here we have a limited palette of earth colours. We have yellow ochre, burnt sienna, black, burnt umber and raw umber. And how even the burnt umber and the raw umber are very different. The burnt umber, being burnt, is much warmer and the raw umber much greener. And by using those we can fool the eye into thinking that they're much stronger colours like the ones below. In other words, when used just on their own and relevant one to another, they will appear as bright as those colours below. Here's a painting where I've used this limited earth palette and shown the colours next to the actual painting so you can see how it works. It's very subtle, and of course if we can make a painting work with very subtle colours, if we then add much stronger ones later, imagine how vibrant they would be. This is when I come back to that business of somebody with a fluorescent coat. If I now put cadmium red into that, it would look extremely bright and change all of the values. We can also work towards the power of a colour. Here are some computer illustrations showing how the same scene can be biased towards one colour, whether it be yellows or greens or browns, and how you can make very different atmospheres this way by just using almost one colour in different tones or variations. To add to our armoury, we don't only have tone and colour, we also have texture and pattern, and look how nature uses that as well. We could build up our canvas or our surface, as I've shown you earlier in some of my art examples, with filler, or we can even use the paint as impasto, painting it very, very thickly on top to go with the forms and to help form actual three-dimensional shapes on the canvas and build it out slightly. This will even help our colour and drawing. You can see how nature camouflages things by using pattern or by using similar colours, as we have here in this worksheet. And I'm going to discuss how to paint shiny objects gold and silver later. Although we have our three primary colours, it's virtually impossible to mix all of the colours you want from those basic primaries. There are some colours that you simply won't be able to mix directly from those three primaries, such as the violets, the cobalt violets and the turquoise and so on. Once you have these bright colours purchased that have been pre-mixed, then you'll be able to make brighter colours from those, yes. Most colours we can work from our basic palette, but you will have to buy some pre-mixed. In the same way that different makes of colour will also differ when you mix them. And not only will different makes of colour change in mixing, but the different types of colour. So watercolour will mix quite differently to acrylic, which often mixes very differently to oil paint, and the different types of those will also change. So it's quite complicated. All I can do here so quickly is try and give you a basic understanding about the colours, and then you'll be able to watch my other films in more detail. Okay, let's start working directly about colour. So we've talked now about having primary colours, secondary colours, tertiary colours, then we go down to quaternary colours and quinary colours even. Our main concern at the moment is just with these three primaries which we're going to mix into secondaries. So anything that's made from these three, remember we cannot make these three, we can only adjust the colour tones or hues of them. So we can't make these, we can make other colours from these, all the other colours can come from these. But certain colours will need a certain variation of these colours. So a particular type of blue is made commercially with chemicals, which we cannot get the effect of just with this or that by mixing them. So there are certain colours like cobalt violet, for instance, which we just can't make. It can only be made by a chemical process, and then we can use them afterwards. But I shall be going into that in more detail. So here we go then. If we start taking these and adding them to make the secondary colours, so if I take the lighter colour first, it's always the wisest thing to do, and I add that there, and I put a little bit of red with that, it turns it into orange. We've already talked about broken colour. Now, if I take the yellow again, and this time add, so there's our first secondary colour. If I take the yellow again and add some blue to that, I'll get a green. It's a very nice green, but I get a green. These are acrylics that I'm using. And the different yellows and different reds and different blues that we have will give us totally different greens and secondary colours and so on. So there we have a green tint coming. Add more blue to it, it gets bluer. And usually getting bluer means it gets cooler, and getting more red becomes warmer. Add more and more and more. You'll see we get a more of an effect of a green. I'm going to deliberately show you some of these other colours to mix in a minute. Now we'll try and make a purple, and it's not easy making a purple. It depends what red and blues we've got. So usually we need to rely on the tubes from the colours from the tubes to make something like a purple or a mauve. But if we take blue and a little bit of red, then we'll get a mauve effect. Look, there's our mauve. So there's just some of our secondary colours. Now, if we mix all three, we should get a brown. So if I take all of these, red, blue, and a bit of yellow, then I will get a brown depending on the mixtures that I make. And there's a sort of brown colour coming now. And that will also depend, and very similar, to the mixtures of those secondary colours already made. So therefore, if I mix orange and blue, I should get brown. If I mix orange and green, I should get a brown, and so on. And to say, depending upon the red and depending upon the blue that you're using as to how brown it's going to be. So you can see a type of brown coming there, rather reddy brown, a bit more yellow perhaps. And that will give us our browns. Now I think for making greys, one of our best ways is to add blue and brown together with white, rather than using black. I'll demonstrate what I mean. Right, I've now added to my palette here. I've got some black and some white here, and I have some Prussian blue over here. Now if I just use the black, you can see it's very flat and very dark. Add a little bit of white to that, and we'll start to make some grey. And look, just look how sooty that grey is. Now if I want to make darks, normally I tend to mix colours, because in my view as an impressionist, wherever there is light there has to be some colour, because the light will be blue light or pink light or whatever, and even white or black will then be reflecting that colour, and it'll be a darker shade of the colour or lighter shade of the colour or whatever. Anyway, by the by, let's take some of the deepest blue here, the Prussian blue. It should be even darker in oil paint. These acrylics are a little bit lighter, and I'm going to add a little bit of warm to that. So I'm going to come down to my palette now and add a little bit of this umber here, this burnt umber, to it, and look how dark that makes it. It's almost the same as the black, but it's much more vibrant. So a bit more brown, and I can go a warmer black, and more blue, and it stays a cooler black. Right, there we are. Look, there's the black and there's the more vibrant one. Now if I add some white to that, then we can get a nice cool grey. And if I want to put some more brown to it, I can make it into a warmer grey. If I wanted to tint the colour, you see how much cooler that is than this one now. I can add more warm to it to make a warmer grey. And we start to just think about how many greys we could make, because with the variety of the whole palette, with all my various blues and browns and other tints, we could make a whole variety of different greys just with the deepest blues or blues and a brown. Let's see what we get with the cobalt blue. Add a little bit of the brown. And as I say, in oil paints the colours are much stronger, so this will be working better. Let's see how dark we go with that. Still very dark. Add some white to it, and we start to get a nice warm grey there. So a different grey again. Isn't far off that one. If I wanted it a bit warmer, I could add a bit more. And also remember, of course, that a little bit of red into it now, look. And that's very close to that grey. So that black, in fact, is a very warm colour, very warm grey. Now the greys can be made then with almost any variation of the three secondary colours, the brown and the blue basically, because it's three colours to make the brown, red, yellow and blue, but with a little bit more blue and white we turn it into a grey. So with the deepest blues and your browns you can make some beautiful greys. There are other ways as well. I'm just going to show you now, as near as I can do it, that you can use something like alizarin crimson and viridian green to make a wonderful grey as well. Let's just see if it'll do it with these acrylics. We'll use a different green, it's not quite as dark as viridian, and different red, but we'll just see. Blend that into there, you see we're getting a lovely rich grey, purple grey coming already. Now with that some white, and look at that beautiful grey we get there. Very greeny grey. You can see the difference in all of these greys across now. And by adding more viridian or more alizarin, I could change that grey to warmer or cooler. So we can work from very, very cool greys. If I say this one again, let's take our brown and blue again. Take the blue and a little bit of the brown. And we're going to make a much bluer grey this time, with far more blue into it. You see the very blue grey we get there now. So we can have a variation for your skies of all these different sorts of greys by using red, yellow and blue to adjust your greys with white, not the black. I'm not saying black doesn't have a place, and we're discussing that with a limited palette. Now greens. Such a variety of different greens. We've already seen that green is being made from blue and yellow. If we just take a couple of palette greens here, look at that beautiful bright one there, then this deeper one we were using just now there, then there's a turquoise green here, then we come down to the blues. And if I were to use the man-made blues with the yellows, let's just see what happens with that. I'm going to take a stroke of lemon yellow right across here, I'm going to just mix into that some of these different blues. Here's some cerulean mixed in with it, which makes you a lovely light bluey green. Take the next blue down, which is the cobalt we've just been using. That gives me this one, much more bluey green. We'll take some ultramarine now and mix that in. Gives me a really blue green. And now we'll take some of that Prussian blue. Look at that depth. And we can start to make things warmer. I'll take now a different yellow. Let's take some chrome yellow, come across. This is a much warmer yellow. And we'll do the same thing. Take a little bit of that cerulean blue and a much warmer green is being achieved. Up next to our cobalt again, and then to our ultramarine. You can see the difference in that. Won't bother with the Prussian. Now I'm going to go to a much warmer yellow still, and to take some yellow ochre. This acrylic paint is a bit jelly-like, but it's doing the job just to show us what's happening. So some yellow ochre, and we'll mix the blue into that. We'll take the cerulean first of all. Gives us a very warm green, almost a browny green. Then we'll take some cobalt. Then we'll take some ultramarine. And then we'll take some Prussian finally. And we could warm those up with the addition of browns or whatever to make even warmer green still. For that purpose I'll take a little raw umber, not burnt umber, because the raw umber is greener anyway, and I'll add a little bit of raw umber to that to make it even warmer. And look at that lovely brown green we're getting now. So there's a variation of those. Equally the other way round, we could go more turquoise. So if I take some turquoise now here, I add some yellow to that, could have done it the other way around. Look at that beautiful green I get with that, a little bit of white. And we get these beautiful turquoise greens. And if you can't quite see that, then I'll put some very light cerulean next to it, and look how turquoise that is, how green that is. You can see it by comparison then. So there we have the primary colours, the secondary colours, and now we're working into the tertiary colours, which will be the purples, the browns, and the different greens. Beyond that we go into the quaternary and the quinary, and then we're going to plum greys, plums, buffs, grey browns, and so on. Basic colour making. So let's go back to that example I gave where I used different warm and cool greens and the varieties of blues as well. And now you'll understand it perhaps more clearly. You can see here the mixtures of greens that I've done and the varieties of browns, and how I've used those warm and cool colours together on this scene to get the effect of light and vibrancy shining through this Scottish woodland. Then we talked about the complementary colours and how one colour affects another. How red looks brighter next to green, how blue looks brighter next to orange, how purple looks brighter next to yellow. We'll just do that, even though I've shown it to you in graphics already. If I take some yellow for a beach, and I then paint some purple in, some purple shadow. So I'll take a bit of purple now and just put that next to it, and even a bit into it. And look how much brighter that makes not only the purple look when it was separate to within the yellow, but it makes the yellow look brighter as well. I will take some green, just like Constable. You'd nearly always have a little red figure somewhere in the painting to make the green look greener and the red look brighter. Put a little bit of deep green down here. We'll take a little touch of red and then some orange. And we'll just put that again next to it here, so you see the difference. And then in it here, look how bright that red looks. Take a little bit of orange, we'll put that in there, it is even warmer still. And you see the brightness of that compared to the green. So we'll take some blue next. Those are opposites, our complementary colours. And into that blue we'll place a bit of orange. Just a splash of orange there. It's not going on very purely, that's better. And see how bright that looks against the blue. It's by this that we're able to play warm against cools, light against darks, roughs against smooth with texture as well. Use colour intensity and use complementary colours to make the colours really work for us and give us dull days, bright days, vibrancy, any atmosphere and mood we need. We do need to understand the colours and how to use them. So you've learnt now how to make browns, how to make greens, how to make greys, the complementary colours, the primaries and the secondaries. So imagine the variety of colours that we can have. I mean, if we now look back at my palette, it's rather a messy one here, and we say how could we make various greys there? If we said we're going to make brown with the red, yellow and blue, and look how many blues we've got and variations of blues, and how many reds and how many yellows, and the variations of the browns and the blue, grey, browns that we can make, or colours we can make, and then add white to make a whole plethora of different greys. There's just one more little trick I wanted to show you, and that is when we talked about black. Actually, black can make quite a nice green. I'll take some yellow there and just add a little bit of that black to it, and it will give me a slightly greeny tint. Rather mucky one, because black does make things sooty. It doesn't look very green compared to that, but it is, and especially in oil paint, it is very slightly green. Amongst the questions I get asked so often are, what colours do I use for a certain purpose? How do I make gold? How do I make silver? How do I make flesh colours? How do I make sand? How do I make skies? There's no one simple answer to that, because each effect of light will be a different set of colours. The flesh will be reflecting colours around it. If there's flowers underneath somebody's face, they'll be reflecting on the skin, and so on, a bit like they say about buttercups and shiny yellow skin. So one colour affects another, and it's the effect of light that you want as well. Whether you want a very low-key palette, whether you want a very dull day, whether you want a very bright sunny day. If it's a bright sunny day, then as you see here, the tones are much further apart. We have much darker tones and lighter tones for a very bright sunny day. On a soft cloudy day, then the tones are being much closer and much duller. I tend to paint about the time of day, the moment, the mood, the atmosphere, so I tend to choose different palettes and different sets of colours for each different painting. And in landscape I try and choose the palette to suit the landscape and the place that I am, so that Bridlington would look very different to painting in the south of France, or in Quebec or wherever. Each place will have its own set of colours and own values, and we'll get the atmosphere of the actual place. I remember one professional artist who worked up in Whitby liked his work very much, and the work reflected the light and colour and atmosphere of Whitby. But when I saw his paintings done across in Italy and in Venice and so on, the light was exactly the same, the palette was exactly the same, and I wouldn't have known it wasn't painted, apart from the images, in Whitby. A shame. So I hope that these images I'm now showing you of my past work give you an idea of how we can use tone and colour, the warms and the cools and the textures, to give the effect and vibrance that we want, and to capture that moment in time in both portrait and landscape, here and abroad. Now back to your question about vibrant colours, silvers and golds, and how to get the effect of fluorescence. Here you see with the eyes, those very strong warm colours painted against the cools, and the opposites going on there. How to get the effect of gold and silver here in my book illustrations and so on. Let me explain to you and show you a few examples of how we might get that. The organ pipes in the distance here is another example. Here we have a little setup, a still life setup, with gold and silver in it, and there's the tones of it. Now if we take those tones back into a drawing, then we need to take them into painting. we look at the cools and warms, how much warmer the brass is than the silver, which is much more greys and blues. And if we actually separate those colours out more, you can see just how those blues are more silver and the yellows and the oranges and the golds are more the brass and the bronze. To explain it a bit more clearly, let's look at the warms and cools here. Here we have the warmer colours of maybe brass or bronze. Like glass, these metallic things are reflecting the light around them, but the reflections will usually be a bit warmer. When we come to the cooler ones, for instance, though, there we have just the greys, we come to the blues and the greys, you'll find that the warmer colours are much cooler and the reflections are cooler still. So here we have all of the colour circle, but with a much cooler hue. We tend to find that in silvers all of the colours are a much cooler hue, and you see in the background here the toaster and so on, we've got those blues that we've just been showing you there. One of the most important things that I think I keep teaching in my videos is that you use my jigsaw method, that you put the right colours in the right shapes in the right places relevant one to another. If you do this, it doesn't matter what you're painting, whether it be glass, whether it be fish, whether it be horses, the thing will just appear. If you get the right colours in the right drawing shapes relevant one to another, these objects will just appear and become landscape, fish, horse, person, whatever. Don't treat things differently unless you have a particular need to. There are times when it is good. So here in this case I'll show you examples of my painting water, reflection, surfaces and glass and so on, using that method, but using different techniques as here with the watercolour. My tips for painting water is that with a smooth surface water you paint the depth of the water first. You paint the vertical strokes, look at the depth into the water and the reflections, and then paint the surfaces on afterwards, the horizontal strokes. This requires a bit more planning ahead, especially in watercolour, where you may have to get the reflections, the horizontal reflections, dealt with first with dry brushwork. Well, I hope this short video and this instruction has been enough to give you a much clearer idea and help you with your understanding of colour. I hope it will also help you in making much stronger and more exciting paintings and finding ways to improve and explore and experiment and really enjoy what you're doing. Well, as you know, I do offer to make films especially for people. It often gives me more inspiration for new titles, and one of you subscribers has kindly asked me to make you a video especially about the use of brushes. Well, on my paintings obviously I already show this in more detail in each painting. So in the watercolours and in the acrylics and in the oils I am using the brushes for those purposes, but in this case I'm going to do a short film, especially on the different uses of watercolour brushes and why, and the different sort of brushes I have and why I've collected them. Now with the oil brushes and with the acrylic brushes I need a much smaller set. I don't need as many special effects. I can still use sponges, I can use rollers as we've seen in my paintings. There's all sorts of different ways of making marks with my fingers and so on. But with watercolour, on that surface of paper, we do need a series of different brushes, I feel. So I'm going to show you in more depth all of the brushes in these and what their uses are. And in one painting we're going to use several of them, and we're going to discuss the fact that they are different on different papers as well. Obviously a smooth paper or a medium paper or a rough paper is very, very different for each brush, because you get into the surface of it. You've got a rough texture. If you dry brush over the surface, it's going to just touch the surface of the paper. If you have a softer brush, it goes into the surface and so on. So we're going to discuss the use of why we've got these different brushes and with those different papers as well. Not canvases, just papers and just watercolour in this particular film. So here we are then, two separate cases of brushes that I like to carry for almost every use. Here we have the magic sponges. You can buy these quite cheap even in the pound shop. Very useful for lifting paint away, especially on a paper that has absorbed it slightly more. We've got our pencils in for drawing. We've got a Chinograph pencil here for the very dark wax drawing and snow scenes and so on, where we can put watercolour over the top and it won't move. I've got my clay shapers here, which are very useful for putting on masking fluid because it rubs off easily. So rubber tipped clay shapers of various types and sizes, right down to nice small wedge shaped ones. So that's for masking fluid. And for the masking fluid we also have special masking fluid brushes in here. That's these little white fellows here, which don't clog up with the masking fluid. We can actually rub it off more easily and wash it off with water afterwards. You don't want to use ordinary brushes for that. So masking fluid tools. I also have in here also this little pen set to go with the masking fluid. By adjusting that, the amount of masking fluid in between here is increased, so I can do larger areas of masking fluid with that. Quite a useful little mapping pen. Here's a Matthew Palmer texture brush. A nice one for doing stippling. You see there's a slight angle to it, great for mosses and more coarser textural work. And of course we will need sponges for that as well, and we've got various types of sea sponges here which are all different in texture and will all give me a different texture when printed on. So we've got texture brushes there, the Matthew Palmer one for instance, and then sponges themselves. These brushes are very useful, much cheaper but very similar again. You see the fluffy end, great for doing mosses and stone textures. Flat ended, very bristly. You couldn't paint a thin line with them, that's for sure, but you do get nice furry effects or stippled effects. And talking about furry effects, we've got these brushes here which are called rakes of various different sizes and types. Look, and you'll notice that on these we've got narrow blades and fine rakes, and right down to almost a flat, but it is still a rake as you can see. So rakes for doing grasses, for doing textural fine lined work on trees and so on. Very useful, the rake brushes. Whilst we're on rakes we can talk about fans as well, which are also very useful for doing tree twigs and branches on winter trees and effects of lines at the end. They were originally invented for blending clouds in skies with oil paint, but we actually find them very, very useful for making either for pine trees and fir trees by just patting them across, or for using a little bit of wet into wet or wet on dry at the ends of branches, winter tree branches and so on. We'll look at using those. We've got obviously our ordinary standard round brushes, and they can be harder or softer, and there's a difference in using a harder and softer brush in the way that it will go into the paper. We've got our hakes, beautiful, nice, soft Ron Ranson hakes here for doing big washes and loose work. Again, they can be broken up when slightly dry to give textures and grasses as well as giving flat washes. We'll discuss that. We've got our wash mops, our oval mops, one of my favourite brushes. In this case I keep 3 Pro Art ones of small, medium and large. These are great for putting on flat washes or painting wet into wet or wet next to wet paintings. With this or the hake and a fine brush or rigger, I can do almost an entire painting. Very, very useful indeed. And then we come to our flats of various sizes. See here we've got 2 different flats. Again, they're slightly stiffer, the ones I use. You can get softer flats, but I've got these harsher flats for deliberately doing dry brushwork, especially street scenes. Very good for dragging across the surface of rough paper and making wet into wet or wet on dry street scenes, reflections and so on. Especially when the scene is actually wet itself, so the reflections of light on water. Then the sword brushes, called swords in this case because of the sword or the knife shape. You can get very long swords for doing straight lines and so on, but these ones again are slightly stiffer. I've got more control with these, and they're great for figure painting because I can twist and move them around at different angles and flick them, especially for the limbs on figures, legs and arms and so on. So sword brushes, a little bit stiffer this time. It does matter as to the stiffness of the brush you're using. right up to larger hakes here. And the smaller flats, not just useful for dry brush work, but also for painting in little squares. You want a round mark, you want a round brush. You want a fan-shaped mark, you want a fan-shaped brush. You want little tiny lines of grasses, then these rakes. But if you want a small flat area, say for instance of a window, so you're doing a series of say 6 windows in a building, then you want small square brushes for those things. So we've got horses for courses, we've got brushes for each course. Well, that's the basics of my brushes. Oh yes, I've also got here a toothbrush, which is great for splattering, and some larger brushes here like this one for splattering as well, because we can just take those, we can either flick them, or we can splatter them, or we can bash them against something to make splattering effects. So 3 different ways there. And that is the basics of my set of brushes. I don't need many more in here. I should also mention rigger brushes for long fine lines and fine work, and of course pens, pen and ink. These are the easiest way to have pens nowadays, and they can be used for effects like this as pen and wash, or pen and watercolour, and pen and gouache, and pen and acrylic even. Let's now see how we can actually use all of these brushes differently, shall we? Now the painting I'm going to use to demonstrate this one is this rather nice picture at Conques in France. Conques is a lovely cathedral, very old medieval cathedral village high in the mountains in the Aveyron. And we've got here this lady coming through it, figure sitting lurking in the background. And I'm using a very rough paper, an extra rough paper, deliberately for this purpose. We're going to leave a lot of white paper sparkling in this one, deliberately, so that you can see the use of brushes and dry brush work, how we can get a brush to go into it, how we can do some dry brush work, and a little bit of texturing, but not very much. I'm going to do that separately. Before I start to demonstrate brushes, we need to talk about the surface we're going to paint upon, in this case the paper. And with watercolour paper we have 3 surfaces, rough, knot and hot pressed, and then different thicknesses or weights of paper as well. Obviously the effect that the paint has on and in the paper is very important. The importance for brushwork is that into a rough paper, seen here on the top left and the centre, the paint sinks into the paper, so it forms ridges, or it is on the surface of the paper, the top edge surface of the paper, as you bring the brush across, so we get more texture that way. The smoother the paper, the less the texture. Let me try and demonstrate that to you now with some simple graphics, where we can look at how a brush would come across the surface side on of the paper, and how it would either sink into those ridges or remain on the top. Then we'll look at some examples. Imagine that you're looking edge onto the paper here. So we have the top surface of the paper as a rough paper, these little nodules. And if we try painting a brush across that, the paint is either going to go right into all of that and cover it completely, so we need a lot of liquid, or it's going to drop into those areas and leave the top areas exposed slightly, or just touch the top areas only. What it can't do is what I'm showing here, it's just go across the surface as a film. It's got to either just touch the top surfaces or drop within those. This would mean that it would leave a surface texture of either little dots on the surface raised bits of the paper, or as it sinks into the paper. And so it would give a very fine texture depending on the fineness of the paper and how rough it was. If it was very liquid and completely filled the surface of the paper, or painted completely over it, then you wouldn't have any texture at all, as on a smooth paper, just a plain surface like this. This is where a stiff brush comes in handy. Here's an example of how a stiff brush taken across the surface of the paper, only touching the very surface texture, leaves the texture on top, doesn't go into those recesses of the paper. That will give you the textured surface of dry brush, which gives you this. If we use a softer wash brush or oval mop and we drop the paint, liquid paint, right into that surface, then we're not going to have any texture at all unless it granulates. Granulating is when the paint sinks into the textured surface, so you get a much more even surface like this. Okay, let's start off looking at different brushes now then. Here we have a rake brush, and let's look at the sort of marks we can make with a rake brush. As you would expect with the word saying rake, we've got a serrated edge to the brush. So if we simply paint a line, we get this, which is great for doing grasses, for instance, like this, in different colours. Let's just do that as an example. We'll take a light colour first, some yellow, some aureolin yellow, and just paint that in. Then we'll take a little green, Just paint that across the top, and a little of the deeper blue coming into that, and you can see how quickly we can make a grass effect. We can also use it for stippling, so you can make the ends of the grasses a little bit of brown in this case, and we'll just put some of the ends of the grasses over the top. Look how quickly we can get a grass effect like that. Great fun. So there we have the rake brush. I want to move on now to the rigger, this long fine brush, which allows us to paint long fine lines. So you can paint very long thin lines, or by pushing harder and softer, hard, then bringing off softer fine lines. So it's great for something like twigs, branches. You can see the fine texture we can get, and it'll paint as long as you want. So very useful brush for painting long fine lines. And as I say, by painting it a little bit hard, by pushing a little bit harder at first and then coming off softer, we can get nice grass effects or twig effects, painting from thick to thin for twigs and branches. So that was the rigger. Next, let's look at a fan brush, originally designed for making clouds and blending cloud effects in oil paint. Now a fan has a multitude of uses. You can have it doing little strokes very similar to the rake brush, or we can do short strokes like that with it to give textures and grasses. And we can also use it with a bit more paint to give the effects of the end of branches and twigs. So let us say that we use now our rigger brush to paint some trees, and we came in then with the end of the branches like this. This is in winter time, these trees. So we've got these end of the branches, and then we come at the end of it and we just paint in with the fan the ends of the twigs of the winter branches like this. And you see how easily that can be used to produce texture and the end of winter branches. So that was the fan brush. And whilst we're on fan brushes, let's take a different one, and we'll use the same technique, but this brush is slightly less spaced. As you can see, it doesn't break up as much at the end, or we can make it a bit drier and break it up a bit more. So different fan brushes that break up more will give you different effects. Let's say I wanted to use my fan brush, for instance, to paint some fir trees, and by using it the other way up, this way up, I can quite simply paint fir tree marks around like this. To get the effect of fir trees coming up. Let's say for instance I wanted to paint some fir trees or pine trees. I'll just take a bit of brown and we'll paint that up here through, and then I can take my rigger at the end of that. I'll take a little bit of blue in this case for instance, and just paint coming around there, look, that blue. You can imagine all the different effects we could do. We could do it coming across if we wanted, like that. Take some green now, we'll just come into those to get the pine trees. If we wanted fir trees, we could come around in this direction, lifting upwards. So you can see how we can get either fir or pine trees. Take a little darker colour, a little deeper blue, just to darken into that. Get our fir trees, or if it was pine trees, we could come across them like this. So just giving you an idea of how we could do fir and pine trees. A little bit darker into there for fun, and look how we can get these lovely effects of things coming across, or we can get them in bunches coming sideways on, as with pine trees. Now at the moment we're using light to dark. Let's just deliberately take some slightly opaque colour and drop that in with this. Now it isn't just the use of the brush, it's the use of colours as well. Now I want to come to the use of flats. Now if we use a flat brush, and we just use it as a pattern even, to take a little brown and blue, and I simply paint in some blocks of squares like this, we can have the effect of windows or stones. So there we go, and we can use that brush flat on or sideways, and there we have a window. Quite easily. Now we can use it heavily, this is a knot paper, or we can use it as a dry brush, just dragging it across, look how we get that effect there. So we're using that dry brush, or pressing more heavily to push the paint in. Dry brush is using the brush with less paint and just dragging it over the surface like this. Same way we could do it across there as a dry brush, just to bring some shading across. So we can use it to either place a shape in, or we can use, being a slightly stiffer flat brush, we can use it to drag across the surface, which is very useful for doing things like reflections. For instance, I'm just going to use a little sword brush, do a quick figure. Here we are, just paint him in. So we'll start with his head, just a little bit of red for fun. A bit of his head here, have a couple of hands in a moment. Let's give him a blue top. Just quick, very, very simple, very, very simple little figure. Just a quick little figure, here we go. Arms, a bit deeper blue again, we'll do some ultramarine, a couple of legs, just flicked in with the sword brush, just why I love the sword so much. And then we'll have just keep the whole thing simple. Now, if I want to use that dry brush again, or I could use a flat, I can use the sword dry brush and just drag it down to give a bit of reflection. Or I can come back to my flat and I can drag that down to give reflection in the same way, and across, down. So you see how we can use the flats to give dry brush work quite simply. A little bit more stronger, a little bit stronger in the colour. So a little bit down on the edges there. Piece over the surface, we've got a figure in the rain. I'm going to move on now to the swords, quite deliberately. This is a sword brush then, this is a fairly small one. You see it's got a blade to it. Normally the blade is slightly more one-sided than the other, like that. Here's a larger sword brush to give you a better idea of that. Let's just look at this matter of painting figures with them again, because what I've said to you is how beautifully the sword brush allows itself to be used at different angles. So let's just take a couple of figures here. We'll take this one with a red top. Let's give her a quick dress here. Very, very simple shapes. Keep our figures simple. Now we can just twist this brush around to give the shapes we need. A little bit of yellow ochre for her arm there. Bit of a leg showing. We'll just do a green top for this fella. Just a couple of marks. I'm making this up out of my head. A bit of green in there. Now some ultramarine. And we can just flick those legs down with the sword. You can do this with a round brush in the same way, but the sword allows me to twist it round, look, and use it at whatever angle I like. The same with her. Got a couple of feet here. Twist it round, can make her face darker. A little bit of hair on him. And just stylise, we've almost got a couple of figures. We can just twist this brush how we want. We can use it that way, this way. And we've almost got a couple of figures there, just impressionistically, just very, very quickly there. And that's the use of the sword. We can twist it and move it as we want. So a very versatile brush, great for painting figures with. And this is on a very small scale. We come down to the round brushes now. You can have these in all sizes, from very large to very small. And again, you can get softer ones and harder ones. This one is a nice soft sable, so it will allow me to paint both thinly as a wash across, especially with a larger brush. We can get a round brush that's a wash brush and softer, or it will allow me to paint in more detail with the tip of the brush as finely as I like. And remember that with a brush we can make the brush into a blade by flattening it. So if I flatten that blade out, I can paint very, very finely by just using the tip of the blade to see how fine that mark is. Or I can use the other side of the blade and I can paint a fatter line by pressing harder, or going from hard too thin. So round brushes for fine details, for fine marks, probably the most versatile of the brushes. But again, it depends upon whether you have a hard or a soft one, for doing washes or for doing fine details. Then for doing textures, I've got this Matthew Palmer brush and also another textural brush there. Let's show you how differently they work. We'll take the Matthew Palmer first and a little bit of Grim Gold, and we'll just texture that in down here by pushing down, and it gives us this lovely mossy effect. Again, if I use it with a bit darker and drag it, there's the moss texture. I can also drag it downwards to get very, very fine grasses or moss. If I use the other one next to it, and I take the same dark, again it's slightly heavier, very, very similar, and again I can use it for texturing as well. So these brushes would be no good for painting a fine line, would they? Because obviously you can't paint a fine line with them, but very useful for textures. Right, next I want to look at splattering and how we can do splattering. We've got an ordinary toothbrush. If I just dip that into some Prussian blue and I flick it, we can get this effect, a nice fine splatter for snow. Or we can stipple with it the same way. If I take an ordinary flat brush, one of my slightly harder brushes, again I can flick this. I can make effects with that, a different splatter again. Or I can tap it over my finger like that to get a splatter. Or I can use a much larger, softer brush to get a splatter. In this case I'm going to use a hake and just fling it on. Great big blobs, great big splatters that we can get that way. Or again, I can tap it across something to get a splatter that way. Now, whilst on the subject of washes, here's the hake and here's the oval mop again. Let's just show what we can do with those on a slightly larger piece of, on a slightly larger. I'm going to start with the mop. We'll talk about glazing. The mop is very useful for doing washes and glazes. I put a simple wash down here of yellow. If I paint wet into wet, I can now bring some red into that. So we've got wet into wet, or we've got wet next to wet like that. So wash brushes, very useful brush, the oval mop, because not only can I paint wet into wet like this and do my glazes and washes, I can also use that brush, as you can see now, in such a versatile way. I can use it side on, I can use it as texture, I can use it finely for the tip, or I can use it fat. I can also dry it out a bit and break it up slightly so that the end is slightly broken to give myself textures like this for grasses and for trees and so on. So very versatile. Moving on in a similar way to my hake brush, I'll take some cerulean blue and I'll paste that down in the same sort of way. Nice big brush. I can take deep into that as well. I can do graduated washes. I can add colour in, wet into wet the same way. I can use it sideways on to give me textures for trees and so on, like this. You could use the tip of it, look, very, very useful. And I can break the end up, as I did before, just now. I can break the end up like that, dry it out, to give myself textures like this, look. And this is fantastic for trees and things. So I'll come right into that one, and we can come around with that. So both of these brushes will do these sorts of textures, and both are very, very versatile. You can see we could drag that for grasses, we can make it more broken, and we can make all the sorts of effects we want. Now Ron Ransom, for instance, as an artist, creates all his paintings with just the one hake and a rigger. It's possible to use the oval mops and a round brush to do an entire painting. Now of course remember that at any time we like, we can also lift out with the brush. So I've just dried off this brush, it's just damp. I can come back into here and I can lift this out with the brush by just drying off the brush each time, as I can with the magic sponges. We can take that and we can lift out with the sponge. We can also take out from any dry area that we want as well. And we can use tissue for the same. So we can put paint on and we can lift it off, and then we can go back whenever we like, when it's still wet or when it's dry, to paint in more effects and more details. And these lovely effects we can get, almost misty there, of the wet into damp. Of course it depends how wet your paper is as to when you add your paint in, as to how far it'll spread, how far it'll be soft, and so on. But we're painting wet next to wet, we're blending, we're painting wet into wet, painting wet on dry. All of these are different effects which each brush will behave differently in. So you can see perhaps now why I use so many brushes. Then of course we've got masking fluid we can use as well to leave light areas. Finally, last but not least, apart from using Chinagraph pencils and stick and ink, let's look at a pen. Because a pen, you can get brush pens now as well, but this is an ordinary Profi pen. Of course we can do pen and ink work with this one, like the one I'm going to show you with the young lady on it, which has had watercolour afterwards. These are waterproof pens, so you can get them in different thicknesses. You can do textural work with them, or you can do lines with them, and because they're waterproof, as soon as they're dry you can paint over them. So if I just take a little bit of yellow now, I can go across that. But if I put water on there already, just dampen that surface, just take it back a bit so it is only damp, and I put pen into that, the pen will actually spread slightly. In this case it's giving me a pinky colour, and then I can work over that later as well to get my darker blacks. So we can put watercolour over the darks afterwards. Right, so there's the basics of my little demonstration. We've used the rake brush, we've used the rigger, we've used textural brushes, we've used the hake and we've used the wash, we've used fan brushes, we've used round brushes, we've used square brushes, we've used sword brushes, and we've even flick paint on, even the pens at the end. Now let's go ahead and use just a few of these brushes on an actual painting to give you an idea of how it works on a paper surface. Right, here we are ready to go then. Jar of water, palette of paints, the two sets of brushes, and we'll choose these accordingly and start on this picture. Now again, I want to work fairly loosely into this, and I want a lot of nice dry brush work at the end of it. So let's start with some of those smaller details first of all. As I say, I want to work nice and loose, so I'll take a nice little round brush at first here, and I want to put in some of these flower areas. So I want some of the very light yellows. I'm going to start with my aureolin yellow and just work out where some of this is coming nice and loose, nice and light. Plenty of white paper showing this time, so I'm going to be doing a lot of this dry brush. First of all here into the bits of yellow light that are shining through here. Aureolin yellow, a lovely light cool yellow coming through there. A lot of white paper, as I say, to leave behind this time. We're going to put our light colours in first, so wherever these light colours are. I want to be a bit more golden now, so I'm going to move across to a chrome yellow and add that in, wet into here. Just tickling it in, look, with the end of my brush and letting this light, lovely light, shine over the edge of that tree. Already I'm making the light. I don't paint with paint, I paint with light. That's how I like to think of it anyway. So all the way down there. Now the other side here, got it much lighter. I'm going to take a little bit of turquoise and very thinly just bring some turquoise through here, down this side. Very light. Just say painting with light, just letting that come down wet into wet to give the light effects here at first. Right through there, right through here, up into there. Plenty of colour, let that come through. And then into that I'm going to bring my aureolin yellow again and make some very light greens with the aureolin yellow, bringing it into these turquoises. If it's slightly in shade here. Again, that aureolin yellow coming up, put my lights in now, through here. So I'm going to leave this glowing through later on. Aureolin yellow, little touch of that turquoise into here, and the aureolin yellow again. See, I'm letting the paint flood one into another to get these lovely effects of light. There, now the flowers, which we were talking about earlier. Again, I'm going to use the aureolin yellow, but I'm going to use a different sequence this time. So aureolin yellow now is going to go on for these flowers coming up and around here. And I'm going to drop some reds and roses into that to give myself this lovely cool orange reds. Now a little bit of cobalt violet, which is a strange colour I know, but a little bit of cobalt violet into this. My cools. Going right up through here. Cobalt violet. Look at the lovely colours we're getting, leaving the white paper sparkling through. Now I'm going to come across to some slightly cooler again, but I'm going to come across to some rose and just drop a little bit of rose into these places for the very cools. Now I want some cadmium orange. It's quite strong. We'll let those come out in the flowers, but you see how now it's gradually building up from cool to warms, letting this cadmium orange now come into these colours here. Cadmium orange coming right out through here, right up here, out and near to that lamp, to warmer colours. Doesn't matter if it's wet into wet in places, still drying off. I still want these, just these effects of light. I'm going to paint the darks in between later. This is just to get my lights at the moment, remember. There we are. Now some very bright red, some crimson. We'll start dropping a little bit of the reds in to get these very, very warm reds that come out here across, right through. Dropping one colour into another to get a brighter effect than I would as if I was trying to paint them separately. So much, much stronger reds here. Once I'm on those reds, straight in now up here, the flowers will make them directly red. And a little bit of yellow to go back into there, around some of the edges, just a little bit of warmth. There we are. I can do the difference between the two. Right, we're going to concentrate on the figures a bit more just for the minute. I want to paint her in a bit here, and I want to leave a lot of her as being light. So I'm going to take my cobalt violet again, come right the way around her here, leave a lot of light across her, right down into her arm. This fella back here too. I tend to do this, but I tend to pick up a brush that I think will do for everything, and I tend to just work with that one brush a lot of the time. So I don't necessarily have to change brushes. Right, I'm going to change across now to a small sword. This one. And we'll start dropping in some slightly darker colours. I'm going to take some red now, that bright red we used earlier. Just drop it in here, let it spread a bit, painting wet into wet there. It's a nice glow to her face. It's more of a glow than you might think, so we'll take some burnt sienna and just drop that in while it's still wet. You can use the brush sideways now here, look. Right down through there. Start to bring some of these warms in here. It's great fun. And that's the purpose of painting, is to have fun, surely. Our foot coming through there. Take some of this warmth that we had, bring it back into here more now. Because I want her face very warm, and his face as well in here, just the same. It's got to be warm, and his hand coming through there. Just indicated with a couple of flicks. That's the beauty of the sword again. Lift out a fraction here and take some of the purple, go back in there with the purple down that side of the face, just letting it drop down a bit. It's the beauty of the sword brush. I can use the brush sideways as a one stroke, or I can use it thinly like that. Again, we'll come back to the warmth here in between on her chest. Just bring in some more that warmth there to get the reflected light. Drop that in. So we want it dark up here, so it's going to be dark behind there, around here. Bit of indigo. And we've got this semi-transparent feeling down here I want to get. So I'll go back to my darks, indigo and a little bit of purple to really get the dark here around her hand. And we can do dry brush with that as well. So I'm going to drag that down, make that darker colour, much darker just in the junction there. Bit of a wash coming through here. where the shadow is. I want to move brushes. I'm going to come back to a mop now. I'm going to start using one of my small mops, this one. And I'll take that same colour and use that. You can see I'm using the texture of the paper more now. And I'll take some of this deep blue and purple and a little touch this time of burnt sienna, just to warm it a bit. We'll get some darker colour, just finding her leg there on the edge of the dress, just so we feel that there is something happening within that dress, within that form. Very loose work. Turn around again and come back to this figure. I just want to drop in some cobalt violet there again, in and around his arms here, and then I'm going to go to cerulean blue, drop some of this cool blue in, a little bit more warmth there, so we'll take a bit of the burnt sienna, just drop that in there, and then I can take my stronger mix of the Prussian again, just find him sitting in there with his pipe, and just by working darks around that you should be able to find this guy. This old French bloke sitting there outside his shop. When I put the darks around that shortly, we'll bring these salient points out. Right, over here we've got a couple of signs, so we need to put those in. We'll just want to detail like that. Now's the time we've got to do it. Right, now for the very loose work. Still with my round, I'm going to take some light green, sap green, just work a bit of the greens around these leaves up here, ready for putting in lighter work later. I'm sure to start doing some big brush work now. Let's take my hake, a nice 1 inch hake, and I'm going to wet that bit of paper first, just where this goes right through here, and we'll just bring a graduated wash down there, right through these buildings. I'm going to start with a lovely turquoise here, beautiful turquoise look, straight down through, all the way down there. Keep it nice and simple, all the way through here, to give one light happening right through that whole lot. Now I'll take some cerulean, just warm it a fraction. We know that watercolour dries lighter than when we put it on, so and I want to be a bit stronger down there, so I'm going to take some ultramarine now. Just let that come down through here while it's still wet. Using the hake only, you can see how I can use it across and quite finely just to indicate stuff for the moment. These warmer colours, we'll bring them out later. More. A big brush. I'm down here now with this big brush. I want to take a lovely golden yellow wash down here, so I'm going to drag that all the way down there. This is cadmium orange, all the way down, leaving some nice dry paper showing through, gleaming through. While I'm at it, and we'll take some more of this rich, deep cadmium orange and place that in there. Down to the bush, down below him. I didn't even come into him there. While I've got it on my brush, we'll just start to get some of these areas. Okay, don't worry about dry brush here. Back to my oval mop, I've got a little bit more control there. Oop, that darker down there. And remember that we can lift off whenever we want, so we can take that and lift that out if I want to. I can lift out that. Now I'm going to use, I'm deliberately doing this to show you how we can use these different tools, but I can take my magic sponge now and lift out that little bit there. Get the feeling of it. And I can also do the same here where it's stained the paper. I want to lift out down there a bit more now, so I'm just going to use some clean water, come down and just lift out around there, just a little bit around that tower. That's more round brush. And back in with the same dark colour. In fact, I'm going to put a little bit of green with it this time. Just come into these dark windows here. I want these a lot darker. It's still spreading a bit, and I want a nice soft effect of light and indicate all of these balustrades and so on. I'm going to go across here again in a minute and give a bit more depth to that. Do you see how I'm gradually building up but not painting too much detail, just picking out light. Just to indicate it. I'm going to go stronger down here. I'm going to come back to my hake again and mix up a nice strong brown to orange again. A little bit of rose into it. And we'll strengthen that again, letting the dry brush do the job so that we get texture of the stone showing through that purple. Slightly sharper at the edge, so I'll push a little bit harder at the edge and to the roof too. And I can break up now I'll just break this up a bit. I can break up the hake just a bit to draw some lines across. You can see how we can use the hake just to flick in some details and textures. Pull things together just a little more, the same here. A bit more warmth in that building. Darken it down a bit, take it down through. Now we're almost ready to start on our real darks now. Before I do that, I'm just going to drop in some green here. I want a bit more sparkle, so we'll just let it come up and through. And we can bring some of that green down into the wall to link it. Right, now here we go on some of our darks. I'm going to take some ultramarine, beautiful ultramarine, quite strong. Really whack that in up here. Down to those flowers. Down below there a bit. A bit darker in there as well. And you remember we can use this edge of this brush to get texture and drawing too. Right down through here. Now I'm using the hake as a dry brush. Work into these greens, the shadows here. Coming through now behind this lamp. You can texture into that, twisting the brush. Now we're going to start doing some texturing deliberately. So I'm going to take one of my texture brushes and flatten it out into this colour. Flatten it out into my ultramarine and deliberately start to texture in with it. It's just to give you an idea of how we can use all of these different brushes for different purposes, which is what I was asked to show, why I've got different brushes, what my favourites are and why. There we go, like that. Quite a large amount of texturing going on there. Well, just to indicate some fencing going down here. Come back with my mop this time, because it's a little bit finer on the work I'm doing. And we'll just start to drop in these shadows under here. You can use the end of the mop to flick fine lines in, look. Right, I'm going to go deeper still. I'm going to take some Prussian blue, brown, and a bit of purple. Really dropping some darks here now. I'll make it darker still in just a moment. Down there, a little bit of light shine through. Don't take all your lights out, so a bit more brown, a bit more purple there. I want quite a strong warm coming into here. That's a lovely strong warm now. Bits of stonework coming out, and I can start to texture in amongst this wet into wet. Much bluer up here, so more of the indigo. Very dark just there. We'll do that twice there in a moment. Indicate down there for the shadows. So how we can use these different brushes for different purposes, and isn't it lovely, just loosely. Now I start to pick out some of the details here. I'm going to pick up my rigger now. I'm rushing ahead a bit, but just to show you, take my rigger with this very dark, and let's just indicate in how this pathway comes up here. We can indicate these stones a bit, just draw around them just a little bit in the pavement. So each different brush makes a different sort of mark. Now back to my mop again, and back to my texture brush now. I'll take the same dark, the brown and the indigo, and we'll just go back in there. Trying to get some of these darks going back in here now. Now the Matthew Palmer one. Let's see what he can do on texture on these bushes. And you see how we can come back in now and add a bit of texturing in there. Back into here I can do it a lot stronger yet. A little touch of green into there too. Get some darks going on. Don't want too many textures. I mean, actually I would normally prefer not to have too much texture, in fact, and to keep this a little bit more a little bit looser. You can see how we can make quite a quick painting by using lights to darks. Again, we come back to the ultramarine and the shadows here. Perhaps a little bit more purple in. Come to my round brush. We need to just touch up some of these darks and details. Don't want to overdo it, just want to bring out these shadows a bit more warmth just into these shadows down here. Just a little touch here and there. Now a bit of dry brush work on those, so I'll just drag that through some brown and dry it out on the bottom of the canvas and just drag across a little bit. Now we haven't used the flat brushes for that, so I'm going to take one of my flats and just drag that here and there. I think I'd like this still a bit stronger yet. I'm not quite happy with that yet. Be brave, be brave. I'll do there as well. Alright, now you're going to go back with some of the whites and just touch up some of these bits of bright colour that we've lost behind in a moment. First of all, I'll just look at this figure here, who's got a little bit lost now. Right, we'll let that dry a second, and then we'll just put some sparkle back in. Before I do the whites, I'm just going to take a bit of red and my chrome yellow and just try and get some of these roses back into here that have disappeared a bit, because they are so important. They're bound to sink a bit again yet, but we'll just have a go. They just give that lift to the whole thing, don't they? So some nice cadmium orange and some red here. And we'll just pick out these lovely red flowers. Maybe bring a bit more orange just back into him. In the shadows there. Right, now I want to be coming back in with the whites just a little to pick up on these highlights and where I need them. Can always make them a bit warmer if I need to. I've already left the highlights quite well, but I just want a little bit here and there. Got little bits of light just dragging across, and I'm going to use the stiffness, the texture of the paper now, just to bring out some of the light just back across here. You see, I'm just dragging the brush across it just to give myself a bit of light texture, using the brightness of the paper again to bring it back. Right, with the small round brush, just want to do a little bit of fine work around the lady. Take a little bit of cobalt, and I just want to find her shoulder a bit more there. There's a slightly delineating line just around her shoulders I want to just bring out. And we'll just tidy up some of these edges and finish her off. With a little bit of detail at the end, very end now. And that's about it, I think. Don't think we need any more than that, it'll do it. Just to give you an idea of how we can use these different brush techniques in here. There we go. And then it can be nice to see the work mounted at the end, can't it? I'm producing this DVD as a foundation to nearly all of my other ones, because it's very difficult to paint in pastels, watercolour, oils or any medium without having a basic grasp of the drawing techniques, of perspective, of not only just linear perspective but aerial perspective, and colours, colour intensities, tones, all of these things that are your armoury to help you to make a painting, especially a figurative painting. It's far easier maybe with abstract in the fact that you can just explore textures and colours and shapes, but still composition and the feeling intuitively of what is right. In this case though, we're going to be looking far more at the uses of colour and effects to make our figurative paintings, how to make things recede, how to make things warmer and cooler, how to make things sharper, how to make things seem more realistic. I shall also explore with you the use of different materials, different ways of drawing in line, in tone, in texture. I'll make it as easy as I can with step-by-step guides and the graphics. There's a fine line between drawing and painting. Here we see a tonal study done just with white chalk and charcoal on some black paper. But a drawing can be done with a brush, as well as a painting can be done with a pencil and using water with it, as in watercolour pencils. So we've a lot to think about and talk about in this DVD. Here's a pencil drawing, and we're going to see many ways of using even a pencil, then into a watercolour. And all I'm doing here is showing you the same subject matter but being used with different materials and different ways. We're going to show you this during this whole DVD, different ways of using line, tone and texture. Here's a pastel on glass paper. Pastel's a very versatile medium. You can use it with water, you can smudge it, you can blend it, you can draw with it, you can paint with it. There are so many ways to use pastel. But when it comes down to real drawing, I think one of my favourite areas is a stick and ink. An ordinary piece of stick sharpened up and pushed into some Indian ink, and look at the freedom you can get with this. This can also be used with your finger. You can smudge the ink, you can brush the ink, you can draw with a brush, with the stick. There are so many ways again that you can use stick and ink. It's a very versatile medium and very useful for using in moving objects such as young children or animals at zoos. Here these poses were only 10-minute sessions. These drawings are for the purpose of sculpture. They're working drawings. They're Chinograph pencil, and I've done 4 different poses in fact, ready for a piece of sculpture, a head that I made, a bust. Okay, let's take a look at what we're actually going to draw with. Some of the mediums will also be painting materials too. I mean, a brush can be drawn with as well as painted with. And as I say later in the video, you can use watercolour pencils to draw and to blend with water as well. Many of the pencils too you can are not quite waterproof, and you can add water to them to make shading. But we'll look at what we're going to use, and then I'll show each of them in turn and how to use them and different ways to use them, and you can explore adding those things together as well. So we start first of all with having a roll of tissue paper at the top, or toilet paper will do, because we need to take out wet, we need to blend, we need to wipe clean. And then you'll see I've got a pack of sea sponges there. This is the cheapest and easiest way to buy them, just in a pack from an ordinary seaside shop that sells shells, and you can get a wonderful variety this way for a very low price, because if you go to an art shop they'll be far more expensive. Down below it I have a Chinograph pencil, and you'll notice at the end that one is able to peel away some of the paper by pulling the string, and then simply undo the lead to make a larger lead without having to use a pencil sharpener. Of course, this is very, very handy when out in the field you haven't got time to be messing about with pen knives and things. And that Chinograph pencil is also very useful for doing watercolour washes over. Again, I will show you some of this technique of using watercolour over pencil and what can be done with it. Rubbers are very important, not just because you make mistakes, but because different types of rubber will give you a different type of effect. A watercolour paper has a very delicate surface, you need a very soft rubber to remove the pencil from watercolour paper. Equally, a harder rubber can smudge, and you might want to use those smudging effects. We call this a rub and scrub technique, and again I'll show you examples of this and how to do it later. And here's an example of a figure study done in this way, and then we move over to London in one of the parks to see how some landscape can be done by blending the lights into the darks, by rubbing out some of the lighter areas and smoothing the darker shadows one into another. And then my wallet of various brushes. As you see here we have rounds, flats, semi-rounds, swords and some hakes as well. Now it can be a bit like fishermen collecting hundreds of floats and only ever using 1 or 2 favourites. We only actually need 4 or 5 brushes, and I can get away with a smaller variety like this for almost everything I can paint in the world. And then pencils. Here you see I have a lovely selection from Derwent. The first ones are pastel pencils, and then we move up to watercolour pencils, and then finally a selection of ordinary coloured pencils and our graphite drawing pencils. They're not lead, they are graphite these days, although they call them lead pencils. And you'll notice that in these they actually tell us which ones are for what. There are some for drawing, there are some for sketching, and we'll try those out and see what you think. We'll also take a look at using charcoal as well. You can buy charcoal pencils, but these charcoal sticks are much softer and I think more versatile. Paint with many tools, palette knives and all sorts of different things, our fingers even, but these little rollers can be quite handy for doing larger drawings and paintings as well. Okay, let's get on and use these different tools, and I'll show you different ways and techniques and methods and how we can explore each one of these different materials and tools. Okay, let's start off with what people associate most with drawing, and that is pencils. I'm going to give you a demonstration using a 2B, an HB and a 6B, and in order the HB would be the hardest because you think of H as being hard and B as being black. So we have HB hard black, 2B 2 black, 6B 6 very black. We wouldn't usually go beyond an HB because if you go H or 2H or 3H it'd be like using a knife on the paper. It'll be very hard and very sharp, and it's usually for those doing technology or graphics and design. We use softer pencils. We also use a little bit of charcoal at the end as well. So let's just see about the hard and softness of these pencils. If I use an HB straight away here and just shade down as hard as I can go, it gives a rather grey line. If I take a little bit of a little rubber and just give it a rub over, it smudges slightly, but it's fairly soft in its tone and texture. But it does give me a very sharp point. If I then take some water and try blending it, it will blend a little but not much. If I now take the 2B, I do the same thing, black coming down, and try blending a bit, nothing much, the rubber, and we get a nice soft smudged rub and scrub technique. And again, if I take a bit of water, we can blend it just a bit. If I use my finger, even better because I can rub it down and in. So brush and finger, and we can start to actually paint with the pencil. And finally, down to my 6B, 6 black, a very black line, shading from light graduating to dark, so shading from dark graduating through to light. Rub it a bit, try it with my rubber, and we get beautiful shiny rub marks, which are very useful for going around texture and form. But if we try to do a thin line, it's not quite so easy. It will get a much blacker line, but it's a bit heavier and softer. So I use my brush with that again to try and blend. I can now blend a bit more and actually start to get a little bit of tone working, so it is possible to use a soft pencil with water. And finally we'll use some charcoal, very black, on the dry paper coming down. It won't go on the wet paper, and we rub that, and of course it will smudge very easily even with the rubber. It means that we can work back into these with the rubber and actually not only smudge them but take out of them completely if we want to make a light area. But the beauty of the charcoal is that it will paint. You can paint with it. So for instance, as I was doing over here, if I wanted to draw a tree, I could use coloured chalks, I could use pencils, I could use a mixture of materials and mediums, and I could paint that and get the greys and twigs and branches coming out as well. Very much as we can do with pastel, but pastel is even stronger. So if I'm using pastel here to do this technique with, we can make it even stronger and darker colours. So that just gives you an idea what pencil will do, just basically shading. We've looked at tone and we've already decided that tone is little tiny fragments of the graphite in this case, but the paper surface. The rougher the paper surface, then the rougher the texture will be of my drawing across it on the surface of the paper. This is an ordinary drawing paper and doesn't have a very big bite to it. Okay, the next, having talked about tone as being little dots, and you've seen the demonstration about that on the graphics, we come on to what we call cross-hatching. anything repeated makes a pattern. So cross-hatching is if I do a series of lines across. The closer they are together, the darker they are, the further apart they come, the lighter it becomes. If I then go the other way, they become darker because I've crossed them. If I go the other way again, it goes darker again because I've crossed them. And the more I cross them, the darker it becomes. And the further apart the space is, the lighter. And this is called cross-hatching. And we can shade around objects doing this as well. So for instance, if we had a tube, we can shade along the tube and gradually come apart with our lines to give the effect of light. Or we can actually come around the tube and we can cross-hatch across it at different angles to give the effect of the tube as well. In this case I could just shade across there and give the effect of dark at the top. So you see that's cross-hatching. Now textural or stippling is when we use little dots and dashes. And the more of these we do, the darker it becomes. And we can cross those as well if we wanted to. And any pattern made, enough of it will give us a darker area. Now we need to think about this when we're drawing objects, because it's very important when you're drawing something that you make a line that is about the edge of the object. For instance, if we have a leaf, we do not want a tram line like that. The leaf will be a broken edge, and you see how I'm feeling that edge with the pencil. If it's a piece of broken glass, it might be like that. If it's metal, it could be like that. If it's a piece of bark, it might be like this. But it won't be one tram line. You must work about the edge that we see. Because if you make a tram line, no amount of shading will make it feel round or give it form. You have to have an edge as well before you shade. So it's very important that we feel about the edge that's there. So if it's a glass, a wine glass for instance, then it may be that the glass is shining on one edge, much deeper down here and darker, and that there's a broken line here. And that would be giving us the form of the wine glass before we even start to do any shading. It aids us to give the shade, to get the shading right. So it's very important that we look at edges as well when we draw. So when you're drawing a leaf or a piece of bark or anything textural, always look at not just the shape of the form, but the actual edge of it, and we don't just draw a single tram line around an object. Okay, so let's just recap on that. We've looked at shading by doing our graduated tone smoothly with the pencil. We've looked at shading by doing cross-hatching, use of lines one across another. And we've looked at shading by doing texture. And the more textures, the darker the area, and the less textures, the lighter the area. So we have three ways of shading there. But we can also blend. We can blend with our finger, we can blend with a rubber. Now a rubber is there for taking things out, you might think, but also a mucky edge of a rubber can be used, so if you use it in a nice mucky place to start with, and then you come back, you could actually blend the texture of the pencil with the mucky rubber and drag it across and even draw with it. Let's deliberately do that. Let's make a very mucky area. We'll have a piece of paper where there's a lot of the graphite, rub the rubber in it, and then look, we can rub afterwards and actually use the rubber as a drawing tool. Some rubbers are better than others for this. You have to experiment, and different rubbers are important as well, because we want a very soft, delicate rubber for a watercolour paper so we don't damage the surface. A putty rubber is very good for doing this rub and scrub, because a putty rubber will take in the graphite, and you can have a small piece of putty rubber that is very, very mucky and well used, and you can have a clean piece for rubbing out. So you can have the two, one to give muck and one to take away the muck. So we have the use of the pencil then, the use of the rubber for blending and for shading. Whilst we're on pencils, let's look at watercolour pencils, because we've seen that an ordinary pencil will smudge slightly. What happens if we use a watercolour pencil, which is meant to do that? We'll take a fairly dark one here, a deep blue, and we'll just shade that a little across here. So you can do your ordinary blending and shading and cross-hatching in exactly the same way. But the beauty of a watercolour pencil is that afterwards you can take some clean water and you can blend it, paint with it, just like watercolour. You can mix other colours in with that too. We'll take a little purple and you can work into the wet or outside it. You can see the difference there, and you can blend them just the same. So there's another option for you. And finally, while I'm talking about pencils, we'll come back to one of my favourites, the Chinagraph pencil. I like it because you can peel down the string and tear off the paper without having to sharpen the pencil. These are supposed to be able to go on almost any material, china and so on. You can get them in different colours. I like them because you can work over them with watercolour and they only blend a little. So you can go very, very dark with these. I mean, darker even than the charcoal. So it's a very useful one for using with acrylic inks or with watercolours, or where you want to work something over the top. They will smudge a little, but not much. But if you take some water, you can get them to move a bit. And they're quite effective for that. But one of the things is they don't move very much, and that means that we can use a watercolour with that. And having done, I will say, our darks for trees or whatever, we can then paint the watercolour over it. So you can see they'd also be very useful for doing snow scenes, where we can not only put the pencil on the watercolour, but we can actually add pastel afterwards as well. And we've got pastel pencils we can use for that, as well as ordinary pastels. And pastels will also blend with water. We'll show you that again in this video as well. So there we have it. We have pastel pencils, we have watercolour pencils, we have the Chinagraph pencil, we have the ordinary graphite pencils, we have water and brushes to blend with, and we have the charcoal. Plenty of mediums to draw and paint with. This is a special pencil. It's a Derwent Sketching, a medium wash brush, and this pencil allows us to, like the watercolour pencils, paint the darks in and paint with the brush. With the brush. This allows us to draw with the brush. And in conjunction with the watercolour pencils or pastels, very useful. Go over that, make it stronger still. So it's like a watercolour pencil, but it's a black one. Now finally, to basically end this piece of film on tools, let's look at fine line pens. Very effective, just using ordinary nibs and Indian ink. People hardly ever use that now because these have come out in various thicknesses of the nibs. They're instant, they're easy, and they're supposed to be waterproof. Most of them are. I would make sure you get a good brand and test them beforehand though, because you don't want to be doing a pen and wash and then finding the pen all washes away. But again, they're very useful. We can do very, very fine areas and marks doing our pen and ink. And I usually advise to do the pen work first and finish with the watercolour wash afterwards. Let's go back into that now. Some of the watercolour pencils. But equally I could use ordinary watercolours. And that black mark should not move. They're waterproof, as they're not, you see. And we can paint in the wash over that for the leaves. We can work into that with our different greens. And if we wanted to, we could put the pen over again after it all. So there we have a permanent black ink fine line pen. You can have this in different thicknesses to work with as well. Well, that's our basic armoury. Sure, you could find other things to draw with, but I think that'll be enough for you to be experimenting and getting on with for now. So let's continue with the methods of drawing, and now we'll start with line before we go on to tone and texture. This is an example of using thin down oil paint on ordinary cardboard. It's amazing what you can both paint and draw with. You must never think that drawing is just with a pencil. It can be with a brush, it can be with stick and ink, it can even be with your fingers. Here's an example of using an ordinary biro pen. And then we look at a drawing that I show in much more detail later, a drawing of a buzzard here that I did as a preliminary for a watercolour, which I show in depth in the watercolour video. But I will show you how to go about measuring and how to go about starting a quite complicated drawing like this in detail. As you see, this drawing isn't finished, it's only meant as a preliminary to the watercolour, although I have shaded some of the darker areas to actually work as colours and tones with the watercolour paint on top. Now let's look at the use of line from artists throughout the world, not just European, but Chinese and Japanese as well. As I say, we don't just draw with pencil, we may draw with stick and ink, we may draw with a pen. This beautiful drawing by Picasso here on the right demonstrates the beautiful use of simple line. Let's have a look at this in a drawing done by me of a horse, using stick and ink out of doors. It's quite rapid. So we're going to work with a piece of stick just sharpened up like this and an ordinary jar of drawing ink. Black's fine, I'm using some purple here. And it takes some time to get into this, it takes some time to loosen up. What we want to do is say the maximum with the minimum. We want to say as much as we can with just a few lines. So I'm going to start working around the head. It's amazing what a piece of stick can do and how far you can draw with it. As the horse is going to be constantly moving, it means I might have several drawings on the go at once. Just simple flowing lines, which are also very useful if I want to go back to doing some pottery. Okay, the horse's head moves around, I have to turn and start another drawing. So we'll have several going at once. As it goes back again, I can then come back onto it and go back to the previous drawing and so on. And it may be that you only get one or two really nice pieces out of a whole series, but it will happen. You get the feeling of the horse much more this way, or the animal. It works very well with almost any animal, whether it's a tiger pacing in the zoo, or whether it's a horse here just feeding, munching at some grass. That was probably enough just to get me going, just to loosen up. Both of these drawings are also done with stick and ink, but on the one on the left I've also used my thumb to smudge the ink a little. Both of these drawings were done in Scotland using brush and ink. A fine brush is a very good instrument for drawing with. Let's look at tone next, and all tone is are very, very small fine dots, or a pattern that's repeated. If you repeat any pattern small enough, it will make a tone, and if we use more of that pattern, then there'll be more of the tone. Here you see small dots that are gradually enlarged, which shows you that technique. And then once I've proved my point that this tone is made of very small dots, we'll gradually go smaller again so you can see the effect. This is how newspapers also do their printing. If you look very closely at the photos on newspaper, you'll see that they're made up of very, very tiny dots. The more dots and the darker the dots, then the darker the area. Once again, let's now look at how famous artists from the past have used this method of shading, either by rubbing or scrubbing or gently blending charcoal or pastel or chalks or pencil over the paper. On the left, you'll notice that the artist had used almost entirely just straight black and white. On some of these you get a graduation of tone from the very lightest to the very darkest. Some artists only work in light, medium and dark, others in just light and dark. Rembrandt used this to great effect. He used a technique called chiaroscura, which is using very darks and very lights and having the figure appearing to come out of darkness towards you with highlights. Here's a Chinograph pencil drawing of mine in which I've used a little bit of water afterwards to blend it, and then finally I've added coloured pencil, watercolour pencils over the top and blended those. So we can use a mixed media even with drawing. These old yew trees are several hundred years old. Then we move on to this drawing of a girl with a sheepdog. In fact, this was done with just an ordinary 3B pencil and then coloured pencils again to tint. On we go then to texture. Now, as we said about tone, texture is a series of very small marks, whether they be short strokes, long strokes, little patterns made, but texture is very much about the object you're drawing as well. So if you want the texture of grass, then you make marks about the grass. If you want texture about the edge of glass or leaves, then you want to be working about those things as well. Enough texture will actually give you tone, as you see here. So many marks will give you tone, as we discussed earlier in the tonal drawings. So why not try a little experiment sometime? Do a linear drawing of a composition and then lay different things underneath the paper and rub on top with a pencil to make those textures appear on top. And see how many different textures you can get by using a brush or glass paper or a bit of gravel or even some concrete or brick underneath your paper in those areas, and see how they relate to things. Let's now look at different examples and think also about the use of a sketch pad. You see here examples of these different ways of working, both by myself and by younger students in the past. And notice that even the simplest of subjects, maybe even just your studio, can make an interesting design and composition. This drawing has just been done with simple line, but notice how the edges of the objects are used sensitively, how the lines are very much about the objects, as in this drawing. They aren't just tram lines, the edges are always about the twig or the branch or the soil or the grass. Even with this one of a crab, you can see that there are dark areas and light areas at the edges of the drawing to show shadows, to show round and softer edges. Of course you can then tint a drawing with watercolour or watercolour pencils as well. One interesting rule is that no amount of good shading will make a bad linear drawing work. If your edges of objects are just tram lines and are flat, you will not be able to make the object look three-dimensional. You will not be able to shade it properly. You have to be aware of the edges before you even start to shade. Nothing has to be copied exactly. It may be like this student, you decide to stylize your drawing slightly, to pick out certain areas and make more of a pattern out of them. Nor does your drawing always have to stay to one shape in the paper. You can change your paper shape to any shape you want. You can play with perspective. You can look at unusual viewpoints, as I was doing here. These were studies done for much larger paintings later, of unusual angles and viewpoints of perspective. Here's a drawing in black felt tip, and then we're back to stick and ink again. Notice how both line, direction and texture are used here to go around the forms and across the forms. If we built just a white room with no shadows whatsoever, all we would see is white. We need shadow or colour to see. Here we have these lines made where the fish are hiding, the lionfish is hiding in the middle. But if we then move those lines slightly, you can see the form. So this is quite an interesting example of how we can use tones or light and shade to show an object, and how an object also can hide. We can also use our drawing in decoration. Here with calligraphy, we've used coloured drawings to decorate this calligraphy. Then back to examples of this rub and scrub technique again, where we can either use charcoal or a soft pencil. We can blend that with our fingers or with a rubber afterwards and make a very shiny effect, especially good for hair or flesh, by rubbing over that. Even this drawing has been done in that way, by gently rubbing in the darks to make them very shiny and smooth. We've already seen this one where we showed the example of the bandstand in London. Now we can get a spatial effect. It's done slightly here, but not as much. When we look at colour next, we'll see there's a big difference between tone in monochrome or shading or just black and white and tone in colour. These studies are all in pencil and have been drawn as linear drawings, and then the tonal areas worked up. This one the same. Although digital photography and computers now allows us far greater choice in what we add or take in a photograph, in art we can literally add or take away what we want. The materials, the methods, the techniques, the colour, the tones, even the composition will all help to give us a mood and atmosphere. Take this one for instance, where we've actually placed the figure into the very corner to give a feeling of loneliness, and then use the lighting and the texture of charcoal to give the same feeling. Then all of these next drawings are in charcoal until we come to the final one, which is actually an etching, but a beautiful use of tone as well, don't you think? Finally, we move into the huge area of colour and colour intensity. We'll start with colour intensity, and what you notice here is that the colours aren't the same tones as you would expect when they're in black and white. Colour intensity and colour tone are quite different. The yellows here look much darker than you think in the painting because they're much more intense as a colour than they are as a tone. Complementary colours are the opposites in the colour circle, as you can see here. Red next to green, for instance. Constable uses that in his own paintings, where there's nearly always a little figure with a red coat on somewhere in all of his green fields to make the green seem much brighter. The effect on one colour on another can make them seem totally different as well. Look how much brighter the purple seems against the yellow here than it does against the blue. If we're doing a beach scene, that can be very, very obvious when we're using shadows of purple in amongst the yellow sands. Here the yellow looks much brighter against the blue than it does on its own against the white. Here's possibly a more clear example of what Constable did when he put the red little figure into the landscape. See how brightly it shines against the green and then the blues. Let's look at one of my acrylics now, where I deliberately use these opposites in the colour circle to make the feeling of sunlight and warmth and heat glowing through a nice garden. You'll see that I also use the impressionist technique of broken colour, that is one colour glowing through another. Let's look at variations of warm and cool colours now. Here you see warm and cool greens, from the bluer greens to the redder greens. Next we look at blues and how they can become warmer. So we go from blues that are cooler and more turquoise through to the blues that are more purple and red, which is the warmer. Even the reds can be warmer or cooler. Here you see the reds on the left are much warmer, going into the yellows on the right, which become cooler. And again another variety of the reds, from the warmer on the left to the slightly cooler on the right, the browns again. We can also do a painting to the power of a colour. In these photographs I show you that if we used mainly all greens or mainly all blues, or varieties of warm and cool yellows or varieties of warm and cool blues, we could produce paintings like these to the power of a certain colour to give our mood and atmosphere. Let me now show you a series of my paintings together here to show you those techniques being used. You can see the warm against the cools, the colour intensities being used, purples against the blues, and the power of a colour. There are two forms of perspective we need to learn about. One is linear perspective and the other is aerial perspective. Here we have aerial perspective that we're dealing with, and we're looking at colours receding into the distance. So we look again at these warm and cool colours, the warm and cool blues. If I now add a one-point perspective to the sky, you can see linear perspective, and we can use that with the aerial perspective in actually forming the clouds into smaller versions as they recede into the distance within the lines of the single point perspective. You note here as well that the sky is warmer higher up than it is further away in the distance. The sky is a deeper, warmer blue high above us and a cooler cerulean blue as it goes into the distance. Let's do the same now with the landscape. We'll have the warmer colours in the foreground, the browns and the golden yellows, working back to our greens and then cooler and cooler greens into the distance and to the mountains. In my beginner's video on pastel painting I actually demonstrate this, but you can have fun too. Just take these warm to cooler colours and make stripes of them in pastel across the paper, gradually blend them and mould them into the shapes you want, and you can make this sort of painting quite easily. And here's the finished version for you to see that it does actually work. But there is an exception, and that's with the sunset. There the colours tend to reverse, and you actually have the cooler colours in the foreground and the warmer in the background. Let's see how that's done as well now. Again, it's something you can have fun with and experiment, especially with pastels. If you just make these shapes in pastels and lines across and then blend them together with your finger, it's quite easy to get this effect of a sunset and add the details afterwards. You see how I just drag the cooler, darker colours in the foreground through to make the rushes and the reeds. The same with the distance, adding some trees and reflections down below, and then the same colours reflecting one into another around the ripples of the water as the sun shines across. Now we look at broken colour, which links with our colour intensity and colours of the colour circle. I think you already know that if you mix red and yellow you get orange, but if you put red and yellow dots together closely, the eye gets fooled and it actually starts to make orange on its own. The eye is fooled and makes that colour. Blue and yellow makes green, so here we have blue and yellow dots which start to look green in the middle where they overlap. This gives a far more vibrant effect of the colour, and the Impressionists use this constantly, painting one colour over another in little dabs with short brush strokes, usually using a square brush, not a round. Here you see blue and red together to give the effect of purple, far more vibrant. It is possible to get a similar effect with watercolour by dropping one colour into another. If you drop, say, red into the yellow, you get a much brighter colour than just having the mixture. And if you actually paint the opposites in the colour circle together, as well as in a pointillist or impressionist effect, look how brightly they shine. Here's one of my paintings where I've deliberately broken up the painting with the colours of the pointillist effect on the computer to show you how it can work. Clearly the larger the brush strokes, the less defined the painting is, but it does give you an idea of what can be achieved. Now here's a painting I've done with exactly the same technique, using that pointillist broken colour effect and the opposites in the colour circle to give the feeling of heat and warmth. Again here you see the painting done, the yellows and the purples and the greens, using the opposites of the colour circle together to give this a feeling of heat, light and warmth. Again here you see again the opposites in the colour circle of purple in the shadows and the greens against the red. This is a very rapid way of painting, a 20-30 painted in 30 minutes. But drawing doesn't just have to be with line or with pencil. Drawing can also be by sculpting. Here I built up the undercoat by mixing filler with PVA glue and then built up a sculptural surface on which I painted on the top afterwards, very much actually as Monet did. I used painting knives or palette knives to do the actual moulding. You often hear it asked as a teacher, how do I paint glass, how do I paint metal, how do I paint these different reflections and special effects? Simply paint what is there by comparing one colour to another. Figurative painting is very much about observation. You have to clearly look closely at which colours are which, that greens are cooler into the distance or they're warmer next to each other. Here you can see the comparative chart I've made of colours before doing the painting on the right of Scotland. Note the varieties of warm and cool greens. This is a palette I pre-prepared for a New Zealand painting of the bush. You notice the diverse colours and subtle colours of warm and cools here compared to the stronger palette at the back of pure colour. But before using such a big palette of pure colour, it may be best to explore and understand what you can do with just a few colours. Here we have the Rembrandt palette of just some simple colours. Indian red makes the red, yellow ochre makes the yellow, raw umber will give you green, and burnt umber will give you the brown. And finally black will give you a blue. And here's a painting done with just those colours by me. Or you might like to try an even more limited palette, a more simple palette of Indian red, Prussian blue and yellow ochre, and just look what can be made from those colours. Of course you'll need white as well, You can achieve all the basic colours you need from these few. It will give you more coherence at first in your paintings to use just a few limited colours like this than try and break into having far too many colours in your palette. But as time goes on, there'll be so many instances where you must have a full palette of colours, especially in flower painting where you just can't achieve what you want without this variety of pure colour. With the colours I've shown you here, you should be able to do almost all you wish to achieve. Now we'll look at scale and linear perspective. Just look at these two photographs where you'd think the fish were minnows until the little figure comes into the foreground. We need something in scale to show the difference between heights. So a church steeple in the distance would show how far away something is, or the size of a tree, a person next to it. Perhaps put your video onto pause and take a longer look at this picture. It's a joke. It actually plays around with perspective and plays with total unreality, making some things larger than others where they couldn't possibly work. In other words, see how many of the deliberate mistakes you can find. Now we looked at aerial perspective and colour. Here we have tonal and linear perspective. These photographs were taken actually in Savannah, where Gone with the Wind was made down the very same track. But it's an ideal place to show you how a one-point perspective can work. So let's start on our learning about perspective with this one-point perspective, this one vanishing point into the distance. You notice how things are larger and wider in the foreground and then gradually disappear to one point into the distance, getting closer and closer together. If you make a simple X somewhere in the middle of your paper and then draw lines from the outside in an X form to meet the middle of that, you will start to make a single point perspective as I have here. You'll also notice I've put a small figure in and level with their head a horizontal line, which is the horizon. Here are a couple of examples of that simple perspective. This road in Lincolnshire in the winter, with the trees going away from us each side and meeting in that single point perspective. This one almost does it, except in the very distance the road curves slightly. The horizon is slightly higher than the road because it's a hill in the distance, which therefore is going to be higher than our eye level. The single point perspective here will almost vanish off the left hand side of the paper, but not quite. You can see where all of those lines would meet. The horizon is not necessarily where the land meets the sky. It is our eye level. It is the viewer's eye level. It is the eye level at which the curvature of the earth will disappear. The figure at the top right cannot see beyond the little arrow which is just below the horizon word. The figures on the right we know are the same height as us, because the eye level is the same for all of them and for us. Again, here's an example of two oils on Bridlington Beach, showing how we can use this effect of one-point perspective with the lines in the sand formed by waves to give a feeling of leading the eye into the picture. You can actually do this with the brushstrokes in the paint as well, especially in the sky. Again, you can see in the sky on the left the aerial perspective used as well, with a warmer sky at the top and cooler at the bottom. Now try a little mathematical experiment which doesn't require any numbers to measure out. Draw your simple one-point perspective and then between the lines A and B make two vertical marks in the foreground where 1 and 2 are. Then join between A and the number 2 at the bottom, A at the top and number 2 at the bottom with a diagonal. This will give you a distance angle. If you then repeat that angle from the top of the vertical line above number 2 down again to the lower line in perspective, you will have the position for the next vertical mark, and you can keep doing this by repeating the verticals and diagonals, and as the diagonals get shorter, so the space in between the verticals will become so. You can use this either horizontally or vertically to give you distant trees, or to give you the effect of railway lines or fence posts, gradually getting the right distance apart as they merge into the vanishing point. Again, here are two of my paintings giving an example of that, where the figures go smaller into the distance and use a single vanishing point. You can tell the girls are shorter than us because their heads are below the horizon line. In fact, going by the feet of the girl in the foreground, they're about half our height. This simple composition of coconut palms in Barbados and the Caribbean shows how effective single point perspective can be as well. Earlier on with the fish tank we looked at scale. Now look at how this figure gives us a scale for those trees. Our horizon is the same height as her head, so she is the same height as us. If her feet come closer, they come further down the paper, but her head remains at the same height. Those trees are twice our height, as you can see, by her. Although this figure is slightly up the hill, we still have the feeling of perspective and scale. We can tell how high the buildings are compared to him, and we feel that he is the same height as us and his head the same level of perspective and horizon. So to go over this again and repeat it, make it clearer, here's a figure the same height as us on the right by the tree. Her head is on the same level as the horizon as ours. The tree is twice her height. The little figure next to her at that height must be half our height or half her height. The figures on the left are twice the height of us because you can see one standing on the other one's head, but because she's directly the same height as us above the level of the horizon. As I'm sitting down here, my head is below the level of the horizon, possibly about halfway to the standing height of myself or you. So you can tell that I'm shorter than you because I'm sitting down, and my head is below the horizon. But note here in the actual painting, you can't tell the scale of how high a person would be. Things change if the land raises or drops in between the horizon and us. Here you can see how the level of the heads of the figures would actually drop below the horizon as the hill drops. Here the field is level, but the mountains are above us. Our horizon point is where the little building is in the distance. If our feet are at the bottom of the painting, our eyes are level with the building. If our feet are halfway across the field, our eyes are still level with the building, even though we're further away. Here we have a slight valley, and our eye level is going to be just below that building, so the mountains are higher above us. In this next pastel, we feel the child is shorter than us. Why? Our eye level is just about under the arches of the bridge. It is that middle path, about 2/3 of the way up on the right-hand side. You see in this demonstration how the buildings, even though they go below the level of the hill, still continue to the angle of the single vanishing point. Again we can tell the approximate height of a wall. It's about half time again the height of that figure, so it's only a bungalow, not a huge house. We know we must be looking down on this village and church because it's below the level of the horizon. In this next painting of the three girls on the beach, we must be the height of the largest child because her head is level with our eye level. Now we should start looking at ellipses. Ellipses are curves at an angle. Here we have the arches formed by half of an ellipse, or part of a circle at an angle. The verticals between them to form the heights of the arches can be used with the same diagonal techniques we used earlier for measuring spaces. Once again, this child will be about the same height as us because her head is on the horizon line. Everything above it starts to come upwards, everything below it comes downwards. And we can play with and exaggerate perspective. After all, perspective is only an invention. If you look at the Superman comics and magazines of the Hulk and so on, you'll see how they exaggerate perspective to make it more effective. Here we have two vanishing points of the road going away and the buildings going to another point above us. Here's an unusual viewpoint looking down on these children on the beach, but if we followed the angles of them up, they would eventually meet about 5 paintings above to the top right. You'll notice that the figures have been painted shorter, smaller. This is called foreshortened form. If we look at a hand coming out towards us, the arm appears very short. Here's an example by using a pencil, full length, and as it gradually comes towards us, you see it not only gets shorter, but wider at one end and narrower at the other. So this is called foreshortened form. In figure 1 on the left, we see foreshortened form from a lengthened cube and from a tube. In the next one, number 2, we see a tube cut at various sections, looking down on it and gradually looking up on it, as to how the ellipses would occur. Let's look at how to draw stairs. On the left, we can gradually see the top of the stairs, so we are taller than the stairs, or we can see the top. On the right, we don't see the top of any of the stairs, so we are below the level of the lower step. Again, we're using 1-point perspective in this, and all of those steps would eventually meet at one vanishing point. I've drawn the horizon level here and placed the sets of steps at different levels, so you can see how much of the steps you would see on top of if the steps come below the horizon or are above it. Verticals usually remain vertical whatever, especially in fence posts. Fence don't fall over as they go away from us. But there are exceptions to this rule, as I show in this painting I did of Beverley Minster. I'll show you exactly how this was done later in the film in a step-by-step. Here's another unusual viewpoint painting in acrylic, looking out of a window at Burton Agnes Hall, so you're looking down on the courtyard. Again, you might find the effects on the glass window quite interesting, simply painting the shapes that we see. This one is far more advanced and not really for you to have to understand too deeply. It's an invention by myself, showing behind myself as well as in front. It's the only way I could invent to show an entire perspective all the way around me except for 1 foot. Let me try and explain it to you before we move on to simpler things. In drawing and painting, we're always telling a lie. We're working on a flat surface and trying to give a three-dimensional effect. So we can't possibly be making a real, in-depth window to step into. We're giving the illusion of that. All I've done here is to try and show all around me on one flat surface of paper. You can see how I've marked out the floor, the ceiling, the walls each side of me and the walls behind, and then had to distort the other two walls coming around each side of me and behind me. Lighting and form come next, and if we look at how these lines work, when they come closer together they appear to curve. When they're further apart they appear to be closer to us and forming a wavy pattern. Old etchings were done with this. An etching is a copper plate with a wax surface over it, and then they cut through the wax, allowing acid to eat into the copper. They do this by the use of lines, and those lines can follow the shapes of the waves. Earlier in this film I told you about the possibilities of having a white room with lighting in such a way that there are no shadows and no colours. If we don't have shadow or colour or form, we can't see anything. So we need lighting and shadow and form and colour to be able to see objects. Where we place that lighting is vital, as in the chiaroscuro of Rembrandt, or the great artists such as this one here, where you can see lighting from different directions to give shadows, the roundness of form, and to give space in between objects. Here you see how placing a shadow underneath something with a space gives an illusion of there being a distance between a floor and the base of an object. Shapes of shadows can be surprising. You see the same shadow cast by the tube as by a sphere. Also look at the surface of the block on the right as to how the shadow gives an illusion of the surfaces being punched outwards. You can see with the highlights in this painting how certain figures and salient points are brought out by having the lights shining across those. By making the shadows further down below them, we can give the illusion of more distance in between the spheres and the floor. In this case maybe the floor is at an angle, or it's in perspective. Now we reverse it and the spheres appear to be going upwards. Next, let's give directional lighting to the spheres themselves and see how effective that is. You'll notice which way the light's coming from by the lightest area on the spheres. Look at how directional lighting is so stunning used in this next painting in almost exactly the same way, instead of spheres, on the heads of the figures and across the bodies. Lighting and tonality can give so much drama. Now combine that effective tonality and angle of light with colour as well, and we get the really full effect of how we can use colour, tone and light. Notice how subtly I've changed the colour of the shadows, because the shadows will be reflecting the colours above them. Look at how subtly the evening colours are used in this tonal painting. Here's exactly the same triangle repeated twice, but with the shadows placed differently. One obviously has a second side to it, the other doesn't, because the light is shining on that side. Also I've partly hidden the first triangle. We can be very dramatic with dark behind and light in front. The same with these paintings here, where you see lighting coming from the side or from in front, and the figures disappearing into the darkness behind, blending with the tones in the dark behind, as I'm doing here with this tube and this triangle also. Just one side of that triangle now gives the illusion of there being a triangle in the darkness, but we can't see it. Again Rembrandt, the master of the chiaroscuro, the dark and the light, showing how a figure can be brought out from the darkness behind. Lighting is also very, very important in portraits. It can make a person look like a horror movie, or much, much softer and more charming. Lighting can bring out the lines in a face or make it look more gentle. Look at these different examples of photographs, for instance. Which one is your favourite? The usual is to have the lighting from slightly above at a 3/4 angle. As you see, if it's straight on the face, it absolutely flattens things out. If it's from behind or above, then it becomes too dark and you don't see enough of the features. But it may be those dramatic effects you want, so it's up to you to play and explore with light. And here you see what happens if we put the lighting from below. We get the horror movie and Count Dracula. We need to use the lighting to its best effect to get the mood and the atmosphere we want, and to bring out the features of the person we want. We can make them look older or more ugly or more gentle simply by the lighting. These are the photographs I decided to choose for the demonstration of my friend Marcel, and I'll show you how to do a simple portrait now. Here are the selection again, so you can see why I chose these particular photographs. I hope you agree with me. I want you to start off by drawing a simple egg shape, and even to get that equal may be quite hard for you. Then draw a line down the centre of it, vertically, and also draw lines up horizontally, halfway down, a quarter of the way down, and 1/8 down, or as you might prefer, halfway, halfway, and halfway again. These will be the lines for the eyes, nose, and mouth. These are the points where we're going to draw the salient features. We can draw almost 2 circles for where the eyes will come. The eyes are coming obviously within the eye sockets. Just above the halfway line we can draw where the eyebrows will come around the top of the eye sockets. If you feel your eyebrow, you can feel that's where the eye socket is. It follows the line. Then we draw the top of the eyes, just the eyelids themselves, in the shape of the eyes of the person that you have in front of you. We're going to add the hair on later. This is just the basic shape of the skull. We can adjust the face later as well. We draw the pupils, but we do not draw the lower eyelid. We show that by a little bit of eyelid, just cutting away the bottom of the iris and the pupil. Next we work on the nose, which again is a quarter of the way down again, or halfway again. We draw the edges of the nose and the nostrils, and just where the end of the nose comes, in again the same shape as the nostrils and nose in front of you. Moving on from that down to the line between the lips of the mouth, and the shape of that line of that person, the smile. Then a little line below the lower lip and above the top lip, and the smile lines each side, and you've almost got your person already. If you've drawn the right angles and shapes of that person in front of you, their face will almost be there now already. Then the ears come between the halfway and the quarter. The neck then comes down from below the ears into the chest. It doesn't stick up like a giraffe on a matchstick, the head of a giraffe, on top of the shoulders. It comes into the front of the chest. Finally we can adjust the shape of the neck, the shape of the face, and we can add the hair, and then we can add the shading to give the form of the face and the smile lines and blemishes and dimples. We can draw the head from the side in exactly the same way by doing a slight oblong box and then the neck coming down from it at an angle. Remember that we don't look straight ahead. Our heads are nearly always at a very slight angle, tilting forward. So we draw this box, we do the halfway, halfway, halfway again lines, and you see how the face can be built on those lines from the side angle. The nose coming in at the eyes and out, then back into the nostrils at the halfway line, the mouth then at the final halfway, and everything else forms in exactly the same way down the head. See how I use the tones behind to bring the light of the face out. So we don't just draw a face and shade it. We think about the lighting behind the head and the face as well to make it show more in form and perspective and volume. Okay, let's repeat that quickly and then take you through to a demonstration drawing of Marcel.
About 10-15 years ago now, I was sitting in a pub and a very tall lad came up to me, be about 6 foot something, big fella, and he said, "You're Mr. Wood, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to buy you a drink." I thought, well, that's a change. A big chap like that. I was a bit worried at first why he was approaching me. He said, "You used to teach me art." And I said, "Oh yes." He said, "So I want to buy you a drink." I said, "Well, that's very kind of you. What's the reason then?" He said, "When you taught me to draw portraits at school, I've now joined the RAF and I'm in ground crew, and I make £5 a time drawing portraits of the people in the forces. So we had a great time and was making a few bob. So there you go. Let me show you the way that I showed him. A very simple way to draw the portrait, to make a portrait of somebody from the front and the side. We'll start with the front. I'm going to draw a full portrait down here in a moment, but I'll just show you the way of going about it at first. We start off with an egg shape. Simple egg shape like that, and find the centre line of the face, so straight down the middle of the egg, and then our basic measurements are halfway, halfway and halfway again. So halfway, a quarter and an eighth. Now these are approximate measurements. They will change slightly, but for a Caucasian they're almost identical. The only changes for the African face, Negroid face, is the forward jutting out of the jaw and the angle of the front of the face, which I'll show you later. but the proportions for this will be approximately the same in everybody. Bigger ears, smaller nose, eyes, slightly different shapes, but the proportions will be about the same. So here, from this point here, we have the top of the nose, and from there come the eyebrows, to the side of the face, and these eyebrows are following the socket of the eye, which is this sort of shape. So within here are the eyes, and on that line, just inside the width of the nose here, come the top of the eyelids that we draw. You do 2 lines for that, and then the iris of the eye and the pupil, and then the bottom of the nose here, just indicated by the side of the nose, little curl there. The lips come here. We draw the inside of the lips, and the ears come between here and here. Now that's our approximate measurements. The neck comes from just below the ears here and into the chest, and the shoulders come out from the neck. Onto that we can add the hairstyle, because the hair comes on top. And it's these salient features that will change on each portrait that we do, on each person. But where they come is about the same. So if I want to put some hair onto this guy, I can give him a parting here, coming down the side here, like that simply, or I can make it into a girl and bring the hair right across and down across the shoulders. So it's only the changing of the face here, the shape of the mouth and nose that will change. I'm going to leave a little bit of room for the hair because Marcel has some hair, even though he's into his 60s. And we have this basic egg shape, approximately the shape of his face to start with, just to get us started off. Find the centre point. We have a centre point, it's easier to see each side whether it's level or not. Same with drawing the bottle, but I'll show you about that later as well. A nice rounded. So that's approximately the same as the egg shape of his face. Now all I have to do is find the halfway point, which is about here, and again a quarter, and again an eighth. Now to draw Marcel's face, so we find the top of the nose here, and we're going to use one of the photographs that we saw earlier, which has quite nice shading on it, which I've explained, the 3/4 angle of slightly to the left and slightly above. So his eyebrows then come out here and down, just around that line, just above the line. His eyebrows come fairly close down over his eye socket, so because his eyes tend to come just up into the eye, under the eyebrow here. So then we have the eye itself, just look at the spacing there. Coming down and around. Then pupil and the iris. Now, unless we're afraid or frightened, we never see the whole of the iris, so the whole of the pupil, and not usually the whole of the iris either. Leave a little bit of white there, just reflecting the light. Same there. Come across to this eye, and we've got to same thing here, it comes right up into the eyebrow there, that distance right. So I'm drawing things, as I said, in my proportions. We don't draw the lower eyelid, we just indicate that with the iris and with the pupil. We might, with if a woman's made up with a lot of mascara or eyeshadow, then we might show a little more on the lower eyelid. Reflection there, a little bit there. And the shadow comes down, just indicate the lower eyelid a fraction there. these are the salient features, and say we can go into more detail with the shading later. All we want to do is just try and find Marcel's face. Hair comes here and over the side of that. His ears coming out, as I was saying earlier on, just about here. Coming down to the line of the nose. Here. Same here. And we come down with his nose. We don't draw the line, so the line, there's no line down the nose. We only indicate that by shadow. And by using some light shading, look, we can get the impression of the nose being a line. And the nostrils here. And to the underneath the nostril there. Same here. Give it shading. Shan't do too much shading on this yet. I'll go to that later. I just want to get a feeling of form. And here the shadow across the. We will just shade it under here. Fraction just under the eyelid there, and the same here. And we come down to this area above the lip and into the mouth down here. See how easy it is to do a portrait this way. We know where things are going to come. Right down to his chin. Now we can start to look at the shape of his actual chin, which is a bit more round, and he has a bit more jowl coming here, a little more. And a smile line that comes from here down, outside his mouth. Same here, with quite a big line that comes out. Chin. And the shading, his neck, his collar comes just here. So you know where things are. Now, we start with the hair. Just out here we have the hair coming, and you see how it comes over that egg shape, because that egg shape was his skull. We can rub out these construction lines in a moment. They were only there just to get us started. You could do them much lighter, but I want you to be able to see them. We can start to make him aged a little bit more by just putting a few of these lines in. Let's take a rubber and rub out this construction line now, because we don't need them anymore. And how to get the effects of hair we've already looked at, and I showed you techniques. So I won't do too much of that here. just a bit, rub in, and my soft pencil so I can use my fingers to rub all this in and get some shading going. And I'll come back with the rubber in a moment. Now I've got to feel these eyebrows a bit more. This is a 6B that I'm using. Remember that B stands for black and H stands for hard, so HB is in the middle, hard black. And a 3B is fairly dark and a 6B is very dark. So I've got a nice soft pencil that I can rub in and work in here. To get my effects. We've already established the basic form of Marcel. We don't have to do a lot more with Marcel because I have his form already here. And we want light against dark and dark against light, so we can play with all of those things in a moment. Maybe with a bit of rub and scrub as well, which is what I'm doing now. I'm doing the rub and the scrubbing. And we'll come back in with the rubber in a minute to take some of these highlights out. Don't need quite so much around there. It's coming over his ears. Take a little bit of shading down here. We want light against dark and dark against light, so I'm going to just explore this at the moment and put a bit of charcoal on there. That was an ordinary soft pencil. Let's just work some charcoal around the background to give my darks in the background very quickly. Because we should always be exploring and experimenting. Rub that in now. It's a bit darker darker still. I'll rub that in. I'm using an ordinary drawing cartridge paper here. You can work up these tones now more strongly, bit by bit.
Now let's see how to draw simple figures. From the front we start off with a simple coffin shape. I will demonstrate from the side later with S shapes, but if we deal nearly always in halfways again, halfway for the chest, halfway for the crutch, halfway for the knees, halfway for the elbows, and use ellipses and circles and simple shapes to form the figures, it's very quick and easy to make a simple straightforward figure that you can work clothes onto and the shape into afterwards. So here we go then, paper and pencil, and I'll just show you quickly.
Next problem people tend to have is with trees and with figures. So let's start with the figures first. To start with a simple figure, we just draw a line down and we make a coffin shape like this, a coffin shape for the person to fit into. This is a very simple way to start doing a figure. And then we come halfway, with crutch, about halfway again, to the centre of the chest. We make two muscles here for the arms so you can join onto, and the head comes into the shoulders like so. What we have to do now is put a couple of feet on, up to the crutch. The hands reach the crutch, so if we bring the arms down, the hands are here. Drawn in very simple forms. The arms come down halfway again, halfway. Nearly everything you see is in halfways. Halfway there, halfway here, for the stomach area, and then halfway for the elbows, and there we have an instant figure. If we turn it from the side, you can do something similar, but I want you to do an S shape. It's going to face this way. We do an S shape down to his waist, stomach, put the arm on, the neck comes forward here, and remember the box we drew for the portrait. Then we bring the legs down, again his feet, knees, and the buttocks. Give him some shape to his leg. And his arms we know are reaching the crutch, so again, halfway, and we've got an instant figure. Now if you want it to be a female, we give a bit less belly, we'll come into the waist here, and out more, and from here a little more shape, the bust, a little slimmer and more hip, and we just got to develop that same one, so give us some long hair, and we've got a skirt maybe, or a dress, and we've got our lady. And it's how to get people in movement then, isn't it? We can move his arms up. When you got to raise that arm to there, remember the angle that we can move at, there's a circle there, look. The arm comes out to halfway, there's the hand. This one can raise up and bend this way, halfway, there's the hand. And if we want to have somebody running, it's the same sort of thing. When we were looking at portraits earlier, we were doing just an ordinary face. But let's just look at a face that's in horror. If we do our egg shape again, halfway, halfway, halfway again, our ordinary face, eyebrows, nose, mouth, is like that. But if we scream, our jaw drops. If the jaw drops, the cheeks become more hollow and more skull-like. The eyes widen out completely, the mouth is then very wide, and we have somebody screaming instantly. As compared to somebody who keeps the mouth closed, and the eyebrows are not so raised, the eyes are not so wide, just only part of the iris being seen, and the mouth is closed and the chin up. So you see the difference very, very easily. So two simple ways for faces, two simple ways for doing figures, just to get proportions. Just remember these proportions then. The coffin, halfway for the knees, halfway for the chest cavity, halfway for the elbows, the hands reach the crutch, and the head comes into the shoulders. We don't have a head sticking up on top of shoulders like this. Just doesn't happen. The shoulders so, and the head comes into over the front of the chest slightly, and from the side the same. The shoulders are here, you can see the chin is overlapping. We never look dead straight, we always have a slight angle with our head. Even though our eyes may be looking this way, the angle of the head is so. You say, but how do we draw these hands and how do we draw these feet? Keep them simple. If I'm drawing that foot a bit larger, so his leg is coming down, draw it as a wedge shape, a simple wedge shape. When you've got the shape and proportion right, then you can start thinking about having 5 toes afterwards. The same with a hand. If you're going to draw a hand, start with the wrist and have a basic ellipse. Then you can start seeing where the thumb comes and simplify the fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Around the palm here, and it's so easy. Keep things simple. If you want to learn about drawing figures, then these little maquettes can be very useful, these little model wooden figures. It's very important that you understand the point of balance with a figure, that we tend to put our point of balance from the heel to the back of the head. So in this case, this is the leading foot and the back of the head will be in line with it. Let's look at some permutations of this with this little figure to give you an idea. You'll always notice that the balance is between the back of the head and the heel, unless of course they are actually falling over forward or backwards. Notice the line of point of balance that I put on here between the back of the head and the feet. Same when drawing animals and birds. And people ask me how to draw birds. Well, there's a simple way. A bird hatches from an egg. So we draw an egg for the bird. We give it a slight neck and we draw another egg for the bird. And we give it a beak. And we draw the wing coming off it. And the tail shape. Instant bird, eh? So easy. What we have to do then is draw the legs. And it's sitting on a branch. You want this bird to fly? Okay, we make the egg shape again. We extend the neck and the beak, and then we just have to decide which way the wing is going. We have the wing coming down this way, 2 of them perhaps, or we have the wing coming up, maybe this way. And then the tail fans out behind. So easy. Different type of birds, different shape of wings, longer beaks or whatever. Then it's a heron or a longer neck, swans. But that's the easy way of doing the basic birds. Now you asked me about doing trees. Well, let's have another sheet of paper and look at different ways of doing trees. Well, there are so many different sorts of trees, aren't there? Let's start with how a tree actually works. If you think about a tree as being an atomic explosion, it starts off with an acorn, if it's an oak tree, hitting the ground and growing from the ground up. Now the trick with trees is they nearly always, with very few exceptions, grow from thick to thin. The only time that changes is if there's a big old knobbly gnarl bit, which is a fungus called a burr, which might be like that. Otherwise the trees always grow from thick to thin, and every time they branch off they become a little thinner. They never go thin, thick, thicker. They always go thick, thinner, thinner. And they usually reach towards the light. So, you see I'm always going from thick to thinner, even if I get disjointed. Some trees flow like this, some trees are much more sharper in their joints, but they always grow thick to thin. Now, as the trees go upwards and explode out, so the leaves come, and the leaves grow at the ends of the branches, and they form layers like clouds of an atomic explosion. So you see how easy it is for us to make a tree, and the roots are exactly the same as the tree but upside down. They grow from thick to thin. Right, and there's my pencil just broken, so here's how easy these pencils are to sharpen. You just peel a piece off and that's it. Wonderful, these Chinograph pencils. So they grow from thick to thin in exactly the same way as the branches did. Now that's a little oak tree, but what do we do with a pine tree? You can have your basic Christmas tree effect. Yes, we're going to have something like this coming down. There are fir trees and pine trees, but let's do the centre stem first, and then we'll just do layers, because one layer overlaps another. They come down and they overlap one another like this. And inside these layers are the branches. So that's a fir tree. If we wanted a pine tree, then we start with the pine tree coming up and the branches come off and out towards us, gradually getting thinner and thinner, and at the end of these are all the pine needles growing in clusters. But again, that's more similar to this sort of tree, and with snow on them then they start to bend over and come downwards. So fir trees and pine trees are a little different. Weeping willows are one of the opposites, because a willow tree grows upwards, yes, but then under the weight of its own branches they can't reach up towards the sky as other trees do. Thick, thinner, thinner. They branch off and fall downwards. And you get this wonderful cascade of the leaves coming off these twigs downwards. So we've got the deciduous tree, which is like the oak tree, just in different shapes, exploding up and out, and then the leaves fall off and the whole thing regenerates. We have like a rocket ship going up with the cloud effects coming off those. Then we have the central stem of a pine tree branching off quite sharply, and at the end of that come the pine needles. Then we have the willow tree that comes up and actually comes over. And these are your four basic types of trees. Well, what about doing a simple fish? All we have to do is our torpedo shape and a slight head, mouth up under the gill here, round the belly, out. Then we have a fin here, a fin here, fins here, the eye, lateral line, and a fin there. Instant fish. Animals are far more difficult. I'm going to show you from the sketch pads ways of doing animals very quickly and then building on from those. And if you do those, supporting them with photographs as well, if you go to the zoo or wherever and you do your quick sketches in a sketch pad, and sketch pads are very useful, and then have photographs too to work the two together afterwards, you really get the feeling of movement. So we'll look at animals more with the other techniques and doing this video as well. Now, another perhaps more difficult one for some people is a butterfly. The thing with butterflies are that they have to be the same both sides. So when doing a butterfly or an insect, whatever you do here, make sure you do exactly the same there and do one line at a time. Try and get them both the same. And if you get them both the same, then your butterfly will appear. And this has to be the same with the patterns as well, don't forget. And the same if you do the butterfly this way around. Then his wings are up here. That wing comes underneath, that one goes behind, and so. Now some more basic tips, especially when coming to doing still life. I'm going to go into the advanced way of measuring during the video. These are just very simple starting guides. If you're drawing a bottle or a glass, then it's very difficult to get the bottles the same both sides. What you find is you end up with something like this. Not what you want. Start with the centre line of the bottle, the right height, and then make sure that the ellipse, the curve, is in the centre. So we have that ellipse at the bottom. It's correct. Make sure then that both sides are equal, both sides of your centre line. If you do that, then you should end up with a bottle that is the same both sides. Not like this one. At a slight angle here, it's not quite so easy. And it's the same with the glass. You know, you have the glass, the ellipse, find a centre line, and you can make both the sides the same. Now, an ellipse, that's the curve seen at an angle. An ellipse is a circle which you gradually see more and more to the side until it becomes just a straight. An ellipse is never pointed, it always has a slight curve. Do remember that little tip for you. So we can get these distances right by measuring them, so they're the same each side and the same with the glass. I shall do perspective in more detail with the graphics, but let me just explain the basics. If we have a one-point perspective, so here's my picture, and I draw a horizon line. I'll explain the horizon line in a moment, and I put 1x there, right across the paper. That is where everything vanishes on the horizon line. The curve of the earth, if I stand here and I look, then that is as far as I can see because of the curve of the earth. That's if there isn't a house or a mountain in the way. But this is the horizon, not the top of the mountain, not the top of the house, where my eye line horizontally would meet the curve of the surface of the earth. Therefore I can't see anything beyond there. That is the horizon, this line here. And everything vanishes to that. So if I have a railway line here, then it goes gradually away and everything gets closer together as it goes further away from me. So now you understand what the horizon is. And this is a single vanishing point. We can have more than one vanishing point. Horizon again, and I'm going to put 2 x's. Now we have two things going away from us, and I'm going to put a line down here, and here, and here, vertical lines, and there is a house. If I put an end on it, you can see the door here, and window there. Now, the height of us is the height of the horizon. So if my feet are here, then my head is here if I'm standing, if this is a person who is the same height as me. If my feet are here and the person is the same height as me, then my head is there. So we know the height of scale to things. So how high is this house then? Well, if my head is here, that door's got to be at least that big to get through it. So the house is twice the height of us, isn't it? You begin to get the basics. It's very straightforward. A lower horizon gives us a chance for more sky. So the Dutch tended to paint low horizons because they got very flat landscapes without much in them, little windmill and lots of clouds. Whereas the English would often have higher horizon and more happening in here. Rivers and cows and animals and things, and trees and a church or whatever, because they have more happening in the landscape. So if we have the horizon higher, we can put more into the landscape. If we have the horizon lower, we have more sky. Now we come to composition and measuring, perhaps the most difficult and complicated parts. It can be made fairly easy though by using certain tricks and tools, such as a cardboard frame, or using a pencil or brush held up to measure one thing against another. These compositions we can make here by the use of photographs, and I'm lucky enough to be able to use a computer to change and put together different compositions and different paintings. You can also see how I've used the brush marks in the sky in a one-point perspective to give the feeling of the sky leading the eye into the distance as well as a broken colour. Here's how I sometimes make these compositions up, working out the drawing first in pencil onto a white canvas, and then gradually building the colours up and tones up one around another, working from my medium tones in the distance and horizon outwards to my darkest and lightest at the very end.